I want to tell you about the Sith, and more precisely, about the 19 Dark Lords who shaped the Sith Order across thousands of years, whose choices and ambitions and failures echo all the way to the present day. It's a story that moves through time in a way that might feel strange at first, because we're not following a single life or a single war, but rather a kind of genealogy of power, how it passed from hand to hand, and what it cost the people who held it. And before we meet any of those 19, before we get to the names and the conflicts and the vast empires that rose and fell, I think we need to understand something more basic: why anyone would want to walk the Sith path in the first place. Because that's the real mystery at the heart of all of this, and if you don't understand it, the rest of the story won't quite hold together. The Force, if you know anything about Star Wars, is described as having two aspects: a light side and a dark side. The light side is associated with peace, with calm, with a kind of alignment with the natural order of things. The Jedi build their entire philosophy around this. They speak of serenity, of selflessness, of service to something larger than yourself. It sounds noble when you hear it said that way. It probably is noble in its truest form. But here's what we need to sit with. The dark side is not the light side's opposite in the way that good and evil are opposites in simple moral terms. The dark side is the dark side because it draws its power from passion, from fear and anger and hatred and aggression, from emotion itself, raw and immediate and alive. And that's the seduction right there. The light side asks you to master your emotions, to transcend them, to move beyond the personal drives that feel most real to you. It asks you to be patient, to be disciplined, to subordinate your will to something larger than yourself. The dark side looks at you and says, no. The dark side says, your anger is real and it is power. Your hunger for more is real and it can be made to work for you. You don't have to wait for enlightenment. You don't have to spend decades meditating on peace that you're not sure you actually want. You can have what you want now. You can be strong now. You can win now. And that promise, I think, is the oldest seduction there is. It's not complicated or subtle. It doesn't require you to be evil or corrupt, just ambitious, just tired of limitations, just human in a way that the Jedi insist you should stop being. There are many Force users in the galaxy, but not all of them are Jedi. And of those who aren't, not all of them learned first to suppress their power before rejecting it. Some, from the beginning, felt the raw potential inside themselves and asked why they should be told to meditate it away. Some felt a hunger that seemed more honest than any doctrine. Some simply looked at their own strength and refused to apologize for it. And when the Jedi Order, which was powerful and organized and had centuries of philosophy behind it, told those people that their path was forbidden, that these truths were dangerous, that they had to surrender what felt like their greatest gifts, well, refusal became inevitable. There was a conflict, very old, that the Jedi Order called the 100-Year Darkness. It's not named with a lot of precision in the surviving records, which tells you something about how long ago it was, how much history has washed over these events. But in the broad strokes it was this: rogue Jedi, Force users who had broken from the Order, began experimenting with the dark side in earnest. They didn't just feel anger and let it fuel their power, the way a warrior might use adrenaline. They studied it methodically. They developed techniques, rituals, ways of drawing on the dark side that the Jedi said should be impossible, should be forbidden. Some of these dark Jedi, these exiles, they pushed into territories of practice that sound almost unimaginable even now. Sorcery, alchemy, the creation of creatures through dark side manipulation, the extension of life through means that corrupted the body itself. When you read descriptions of these things, they sound less like philosophy and more like desperation, people clawing at power in ways that hollowed them out from inside. But in the moment, to the people who were doing it, I imagine it felt like transcendence. And the Jedi were horrified. The Jedi Order moved against them, a full confrontation, and in the historical record, in what we know now, the Jedi won. The Dark Jedi were defeated, scattered, exiled. But some of them escaped to the edges of the known galaxy, to a planet far from the centers of power. And this is where our story truly begins. The planet was called Korriban, and it was ruled by a native species, red-skinned people who had built a civilization there over centuries. The exiled Dark Jedi arrived on Korriban like refugees, like survivors running from a war they had lost. And the native Sith species, because that's what they were called, the Sith had never seen anything like these Force users before. They had their own connection to the Force, their own traditions and rituals, but the Dark Jedi had knowledge that seemed to elevate it to something else entirely. The Dark Jedi were strong in ways the native Sith had never known. And because strength was impressed upon them, and because the Dark Jedi had nowhere else to go, and the Sith species were willing to accept them, something remarkable and terrible happened. The two peoples merged. The exiled Dark Jedi interbred with the Sith species, taught them the dark side techniques they had developed, blended the newcomers' knowledge with the old Sith traditions that already existed on that world. Over time, the term Sith came to refer not just to the original native species, but to the entire order of dark side practitioners that arose from this union. And what emerged was a civilization built on principles entirely foreign to the Jedi. Where the Jedi believed in peace and selflessness, the Sith believed in passion as a source of strength, not passion as an emotion to be felt and released, but passion as fuel, as an engine that drove ambition and power. They developed a philosophy which would later be condensed into something called the Code of the Sith. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. And from passion, you could build anything. To the Sith, strength was the highest virtue, because strength was the only thing that truly mattered. The weak would be consumed, the strong would rule, and there was no point in denying this or dressing it up in moral language. This was simply the way the universe worked, and to deny your hunger for power was to deny reality itself. Now on Korriban, in the Valley of the Dark Lords, the Sith built tombs and palaces and a culture that lasted for thousands of years. And from this world, which became their true home, they would eventually look outward to a galaxy they intended to conquer. But first, they had to build something. They had to transform themselves from refugees and outcasts into something that could rival the Jedi Order itself. And that transformation, the slow accumulation of power, the cultivation of ever stronger dark side practitioners, the philosophies that emerged to justify it all, that is where the 19 Dark Lords we're about to meet began to take shape. There's something I keep thinking about when I dwell on this origin, and it's this. The Jedi didn't fail to prevent the Sith because they weren't strong enough. They failed because they were convinced that the dark side was inherently self-defeating, that it would consume anyone who pursued it, that its followers would inevitably turn on each other and destroy themselves. And maybe, in a way, the Jedi were right about that, but not in the way they expected. The Sith didn't destroy themselves because of some cosmic law of the dark side. They would destroy themselves through betrayal, through the relentless application of their own philosophy, through the belief that only one person should hold the ultimate power. And that story, the long cascade of darkness, the way strength and hunger kept building on each other, the 19 figures who embodied it, that is what we're about to explore together. In the aftermath of the 100-year darkness, something extraordinary happened. The Jedi Order believed they had won, and in a sense they had, but they had also made a choice that would reverberate across 10,000 years. The Dark Jedi who had broken from the Order's teachings, who had spent a century warring in the shadows, experimenting with forbidden arts, pushing the boundaries of what the Force could be made to do, they were not executed. Instead, they were exiled, cast out into the unknown regions beyond the reach of Republic space, left to find their own way into oblivion. It was an act of mercy, perhaps, or maybe it was mercy's cruelest form. To exile someone rather than end them is to say you trust they will destroy themselves without your help. But the Jedi would learn, over the long centuries, that they had misjudged both the darkness and the strength of those who had chosen it. The exiles traveled deep into the Outer Rim, their ships cutting through the void, carrying with them the knowledge they had gathered, not just the philosophy of passion and power, but the practical techniques of what the Jedi called Sith alchemy, the twisting of the Force itself into shapes the light side would never permit. And after months or perhaps years of wandering, they arrived at a world that seemed almost designed for them. Korriban, a red-dusted desert planet orbiting a dying star, ancient and weathered, and steeped in an old, old darkness. What they found there was unexpected. The planet was not empty. There lived there a native species, humanoid and red-skinned, a people who had developed in isolation, who possessed no connection to the Force as the Jedi understood it, but who had their own traditions, their own magic, practices rooted in the planet itself, and in something that sang to the dark side in ways the exiled Dark Jedi recognized immediately. It is strange to imagine how that first meeting must have felt. Two peoples, neither knowing the other existed, suddenly face to face. The Dark Jedi brought with them technology far beyond what the native Sith possessed, and they brought the Force itself, channeled through bodies trained in disciplines the Sith had never encountered. To the native people, these exiles appeared as gods descending from the sky. And the exiles, I think, allowed themselves to be worshipped. There is a kind of logic to it. The Jedi had rejected them, had cast them out as failures, and here was a people ready to see them not as fallen or broken, but as divine. The Dark Jedi established themselves as rulers, as masters, and gradually, over generations, something remarkable and terrible took shape. The two cultures did not remain separate. There was interbreeding, cultural fusion, an absorption of the native Sith's own dark traditions into the teachings the Dark Jedi brought with them. The native Sith magic, the sorcery that had developed in isolation on Korriban, merged with the Force techniques of the exiles until it became impossible to say where one ended and the other began. What emerged was a civilization unlike anything the galaxy had seen. The Sith Empire, built not on the Jedi ideals of peace or harmony or the careful cultivation of serenity, but on the explicit, unapologetic philosophy that strength was the only virtue and weakness deserved only consumption. The code that would govern this civilization was carved into stone and into the minds of every being who served it. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. Through passion I gain strength. Through strength I gain power. Through power I gain victory. Through victory my chains are broken. It was a complete inversion of everything the Jedi taught. Where the Jedi said passion clouds judgment, the Sith said passion is the source of all strength. Where the Jedi said attachment is the root of suffering, the Sith said desire is the root of greatness. Where the Jedi said the weak and the strong have equal worth, the Sith said the strong deserve dominion and the weak deserve only to serve or fall. And here is what I find myself thinking about most. This was not forced upon unwilling people. The native Sith embraced this philosophy with the fervor of a people who had found their truth articulated at last. Their world had always been harsh, always rewarded strength and punished weakness. The desert taught those lessons to anyone who lived long enough to learn them. The exiled Dark Jedi had simply given shape to principles that were already written into Korriban's red sand and burning sky. Over centuries, the Sith civilization grew in isolation from the Republic, developing in darkness, creating not just a military force, but an entire culture of power. They built the Valley of the Dark Lords, great tombs and monuments to their strongest, where the bodies of the mightiest Sith Lords would be preserved, and their essences, it was believed, would linger in the Force itself, calling to those who came after. They developed Sith alchemy, an art that combined the mechanical technology they had inherited with the Force channeled in ways that made living things into weapons, that twisted flesh and spirit into shapes of horror and power. They created holocrons, crystalline repositories of knowledge that held not just information, but the essence of the Sith Lords themselves, so that even death could not sever their teaching from those who came after. And they built, slowly and with terrible patience, the infrastructure of an empire that would eventually seek to consume the Jedi and replace the Republic itself. The Jedi, in those early centuries, believed that the dark side would destroy itself, that an order built on betrayal and the philosophy that the strong should dominate the weak would fracture under its own contradictions, would tear itself to pieces. And they were not entirely wrong. Betrayal would indeed become the engine of Sith history, would indeed drive them toward internal ruin. But they were wrong about the timeline, wrong about the speed of that collapse. The Sith would endure, would grow, would wage wars that would shake the foundations of the Republic itself, and would not fall for 10,000 years. And by then, the corruption they carried would have seeped so deeply into the galaxy that even the ultimate triumph of the light side would come at a cost that history would struggle to fully reckon. So we are left with this strange truth. The mercy the Jedi showed to their exiled enemies became, perhaps, the greatest mistake the Jedi Order ever made. And the Dark Jedi, cast out and seemingly defeated, had found a world where they could not just survive but thrive, where their philosophy would not be questioned or resisted, where darkness could grow in isolation until it had grown strong enough to challenge the light itself. So they are here now, on Korriban, and the question that follows, the one that kept the Jedi Order awake on distant worlds, is what they will do with it. The exiles did not arrive as refugees, though that is what they were. They arrived as conquerors, which is perhaps the more honest word for what exile makes of a person when that person has been trained in absolute power. Korriban itself was not empty, and this matters because it means the Sith Empire did not begin with nothing. It began with something the exiles could reshape in their own image. The native Sith, the red-skinned people of that world, had their own civilization, their own dark traditions, their own understanding of Force magic stretching back further than the exiles' arrival by countless generations. Some of them had achieved what the ancient texts called the Sithari, a figure of perfect messianic power, and there had been kings, like Ada's, who had unified that world in ages so distant they felt almost mythological. But the Dark Jedi who came from the Republic possessed something the native Sith did not. They had been trained in the discipline of the Force through a tradition 10,000 years old, and they had seen how that discipline could be inverted, how the very structures of Jedi teaching could be turned inside out and used as instruments of darkness. The native Sith looked at these beings and saw gods made flesh. There was no resistance that mattered, no moment of heroic last stand, because the power differential was absolute, not in cruelty, not in malice, but in the simple fact that one group possessed the knowledge and the strength to dominate, and the other did not. And so the exiles did what the powerful have always done. They took what they found and made it theirs. Over generations, and this is important because empires are not built in a single lifetime, but across many, the two peoples began to blur together. The Dark Jedi took partners from among the native Sith, and their children carried both bloodlines in their veins, and the children of those children carried them still, until you could no longer separate what had been brought from beyond the stars from what had grown in Korriban's soil and darkness. The word Sith came to mean both the species and the order because the distinction had lost its sharpness. They had become one civilization, one ruling caste, with the Dark Jedi as the priesthood at its apex. I think this matters because it shows you something important about how power actually works. It does not remain pure, and it does not remain distant. It mingles, it marries. It creates new forms of itself in every generation. The Sith Empire grew not through the will of one ruler, but through the slow accumulation of centuries, each Dark Lord taking what his predecessors had built and adding to it, layer upon layer, until what stood was vast and self-perpetuating. They turned their hidden world into a fortress, and then they began to make it into something else entirely. A civilization devoted entirely to the dark side, where the code that the first exiles had written was not philosophy, but law. Peace is a lie. There is only passion. From passion, they drew strength. From strength, they built order. The weak were consumed by the strong. This was not cruelty in their view, but truth, the natural law of the cosmos expressed through will and force power. They developed sorceries that the Jedi would have called abominations, arts that took the dark side and twisted it into new shapes, that bent matter itself, that created life and unmade it again. They built creatures in the depths of their temples, monsters wrought from Sith alchemy, beasts of muscle and fang, and dark side hunger that could serve as instruments of war. They forged weapons from materials they had learned to work through magic, synthetic crystals that sang with artificial light in shades of red, that seemed to drink the blood of the slain. And all of this, the towers rising above the valley of the Dark Lords, the vast necropolises where Dark Lords were entombed with the treasures of their reigns, the libraries of holocrons containing knowledge gathered across centuries. All of it was in service of a single, unwavering philosophy, the strong rule, and the rest exist to serve them or perish. What's interesting, when you sit with it for a moment, is that this was in some ways more honest than the Jedi's claim of balance. The Jedi said that strength without compassion was blindness, that the strong had a duty to protect the weak, that power without restraint was not power at all but merely destruction. The Sith looked at that teaching and said, "No, that's the comfort the fortunate tell themselves so they can sleep at night. We will not comfort ourselves with lies. Strength is the only truth, and the only morality is the will to expand it." The Jedi worried that the dark side would consume itself through its own nature, that beings devoted to ambition and the hunger for power could never cooperate, could never build something lasting. But what the Jedi had not fully reckoned with was this: structure itself is a form of power, and hierarchy is a way of channeling ambition that does not require every member of the Order to be satisfied at every moment. You do not need your Dark Lords to love each other. You need them to fear each other and the throne alike, and to understand that their strength is best served by serving the Sith Empire rather than destroying it, at least not yet. Centuries passed in this way, and the Sith Empire grew. They were hidden from the known galaxy, separated by vast stretches of unexplored space and the unknown regions, a civilization building itself in darkness, growing in power and in confidence. The Jedi Order moved forward in their wars and their politics and their endless effort to maintain the balance of the light side, unaware or perhaps uncaring that in the darkness beyond the edge of the map, something was preparing itself. And perhaps the Jedi were right to not be overly concerned, because the Sith Empire did not emerge immediately with conquest on their mind. They had the luxury of time and the deep certainty that came from absolute power within their own borders. They could afford to wait, to grow, to perfect the dark side knowledge they possessed, and to add to it the secrets they discovered in Korriban's ancient stones. But the day would come when that patience would end, when a Dark Lord would decide that the strength they had gathered was sufficient to be unleashed upon the wider galaxy. That day was not yet, but it was coming. And when it arrived, the Republic would learn something the Jedi had believed but never truly tested: that a civilization devoted entirely to the dark side, unified in purpose, backed by centuries of accumulated power and forbidden knowledge, was a threat unlike any they had faced before. For now, though, in this era of the Sith Empire's rise, there is something almost meditative about it, something slow and deliberate and utterly without doubt. They are building. They are preparing. And in the depths of Korriban's temples, in the tombs of Dark Lords beginning to accumulate in the valley, in the laboratories where Sith sorcerers work to wring new secrets from the dark side, there is no question, no hesitation, no fear that they might not succeed. They are the strong, and the strong, in their view, do not fail. They simply consume. 5,000 years before the films, on the dark planet Korriban, a man named Ajanta Paul stood in the ruins of a native Sith temple and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had found a home. He had been many things before this: a Jedi for a time, trained in the disciplines of the Order, taught to master his passions and channel them into service and restraint. He had been a visionary in his own mind, a dark Jedi who saw in the forbidden techniques of the dark side not corruption but clarity, not weakness but truth. He had been a revolutionary, leading others like himself in the 100-year darkness against the Order that shackled them, a war that had lasted exactly as long as its name and ended in total defeat. He had been an exile, cast out into the unknown regions by the Jedi, banished far beyond the reach of the Republic, with the expectation that he and his kind would scatter and fade into irrelevance. All of these chapters of his life had led here to this moment, and to the understanding that everything he had fought for, every forbidden technique, every forbidden thought, was not a corruption of the Force, but a return to what it had always meant to be. The native Sith people found them first, or perhaps it is more honest to say that Ajanta Paul and the other exiled Dark Jedi found the Sith people and recognized immediately what they had discovered: a civilization already attuned to the dark side, already built on principles of power and strength, waiting only for a guide to show them how much further they could go. The Sith were red-skinned, Force-sensitive from birth, and they possessed their own tradition of dark magic, ancient, brutal, unshaped by the Jedi's centuries of refinement, but genuine in its understanding of the passions that the Force fed upon. When they saw what Ajanta Paul and his followers could do, they saw gods. And Ajanta Paul, I think, saw something he had never expected to see again after exile: a people who did not fear the dark side, who did not see it as a fall or a corruption, but as a birthright and a strength. He did not have to convince them of anything. He only had to teach them how to master what was already within them. He conquered them quickly, or perhaps another way to say it is that he offered them a compact, a ruling alliance. The exiled Dark Jedi would stand above the native Sith, teaching them the refined techniques of Force manipulation, the disciplines of the dark side, the philosophy that had burned beneath everything he had fought for. In return, the native Sith would build and serve and populate the kingdom that would rise on Korriban, a fortress of darkness hidden in the Stygian caldera, unreachable and unknowable to the Republic that had cast him out. What Ajanta Paul established, there was not a religion but a system, not a faith but a hierarchy, and at the top of that hierarchy stood the principle that would define everything the Sith would become: the strong rule and the weak serve, and this is not a perversion of power but its truest expression. He took the title Dark Lord of the Sith, and it was a title that would echo across millennia, held by others who came after him, but it began with him, with the choice he made to stop fighting the darkness and to instead build something from it. Over generations, the exiled Dark Jedi interbred with the native Sith people, and the bloodlines blurred, and the term Sith came to mean not just the native red-skinned species, but the entire order that sprang from their fusion. Both the people and the philosophy became one thing, bound together in Ajanta Paul's vision of absolute strength. They built the Valley of the Dark Lords in those early centuries, great monumental tombs carved into the stone of Korriban, places where the bodies of the greatest Sith would be interred, and their spirits, the Sith believed, would linger, would watch, would counsel their successors from beyond death itself. There is something I find myself thinking about in all of this: the ways in which a person can convince themselves that power is not a corruption, but a liberation. Ajanta Paul had been exiled as a failure, had been cast out by an order that saw his ambitions as a falling away from truth. And then he found a place where his philosophy was not merely accepted, but was the foundation of an entire civilization, where the principles he had fought for were not seen as wrong but as obvious, as natural as right. I wonder if he genuinely believed, in those early years on Korriban, that he had found redemption rather than ruin, that he had finally reached a place where his gifts would be honored rather than constrained. The Jedi believed, in those distant days, that the dark side would inevitably destroy itself, that the philosophy of strength over weakness, of ambition and passion unchecked, would simply cannibalize its own practitioners until nothing remained but ash. They were not wrong about this, exactly, but they were wrong about the timeline. The Sith did not fall in Ajunta Paul's generation, nor in the generations that followed immediately after him. Korriban endured, and it grew, and it accumulated power and knowledge and technique across centuries, all hidden from the view of the Republic, all waiting for the moment when the Sith would emerge again and remind the Jedi that exile is not the same as destruction. When Ajunta Paul finally died, his body was entombed in the Valley of the Dark Lords that he had ordered built, and his spirit, the Sith believed, remained there still, watching and waiting and grieving in ways that would not become clear until thousands of years had passed, and a wandering Jedi would come to Korriban seeking answers about the nature of power and redemption. But all of that was in the future, beyond his sight, beyond even the sight of the dark side. In his own time, Ajunta Paul had done what he set out to do. He had taken the dark side from a set of forbidden techniques, a rebellion against the Jedi Order, and transformed it into a civilization, into a permanent claim on a corner of the galaxy, into a philosophy that would outlive him by thousands of years, and become the foundation upon which all the Sith Lords that followed would build their own ambitions and their own darknesses. He had made the dark side permanent, and that, perhaps more than any act of conquest or sorcery, was his true legacy, not the tombs or the temples, but the idea that had been written into Korriban's very stone. That power, absolute and unchecked and celebrated, could endure, could grow, could call itself civilization. It is a legacy that begins to fracture almost immediately, of course, but in those early centuries, under Ajunta Paul's rule, the Sith Order looked like a kingdom, and the dark side looked like home. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of two civilizations poised against each other across the void, neither quite able to deliver a killing blow, each certain that time was running in its favor. The Jedi Order, spread across the settled galaxy, believed the Sith Empire beyond the Outer Rim would collapse under the weight of its own darkness and ambition. The Sith Lords, patient and hidden, believed that eventually, when the moment ripened, their accumulated power would wash across the galaxy like a tide that even the Jedi could not contain. Between these two certainties lay centuries of smaller wars, infiltrations, and moments of terror that shaped the galaxy's understanding of the dark side. What we call the War of Light and Dark is not really one conflict. It is a long, slow-burning war made up of many fires, some brief and brilliant, others grinding on for years. The earliest of these, and the one that still echoes through Sith history, began some 5,000 years before the events we will come to, when a lost Republic hyperspace scout named Gav Daragan stumbled across something that was not supposed to be found. He and his sister Jory, explorers in search of new trade routes, jumped their ship through uncharted space and emerged to sea, hanging in the darkness, a civilization of impossible sophistication. The Sith Empire itself, hidden for millennia beyond the unknown regions. The Daragans did not mean to start a war. They simply tried to leave, to report what they had seen, but the Sith, or at least one Sith Lord in particular, saw the opportunity hidden in that moment. His name was Naga Sado, and he was a creature of ambition in a way that the Sith understood perfectly. Marka Ragnos, the supreme Dark Lord of his time, had died, and with his death came the thing the Sith always feared and always craved, a power vacuum. Naga Sado moved to fill it, and the Daragan's discovery became his pretext and his weapon. He would use the Republic's fear of the Sith, the very fact of their existence, so long hidden, to unite the squabbling Dark Lords of Korriban under his rule. It is a move I find myself thinking about a lot. The way ambition disguises itself as inevitability, the way a single person can convince an entire civilization that what they want is what the times demand. The Great Hyperspace War, they called it afterward. Naga Sadow's fleets poured through hyperspace in a flood of crimson and black, carrying with them the accumulated wealth and dark power of 5,000 years of Sith rule. But there was another voice in the Sith Empire, another Dark Lord who believed Naga Sadow's time had not come. Ludo Kresh, who challenged him, who wanted the war delayed or prevented entirely. What happened between them was almost a sideshow to the Republic's eyes, but it mattered enormously to what came next. Naga Sadow prevailed, but Kresh's doubt had already planted a seed. The idea that the Sith were, even at their moment of greatest power, still divided. When the Republic mounted its defense, it was not a gathering of vast fleets, but a coordinated series of strategies and attacks that exploited precisely that fracture. Naga Sadow himself managed to survive the war's end, fleeing deeper into the unknown regions to a jungle moon called Yavin 4, where he would rule the remnants of his forces and the warrior caste known as the Masasi. But the moment had passed. The great gamble had failed, and the Sith Empire retreated once more into shadow. There is something almost heartbreaking in that retreat, I think, the recognition that power alone is not enough, that even when you have gathered it meticulously across 5,000 years, it can still slip through your fingers in a single war. But the Sith did not disappear. Instead, they became more patient, more cunning, more willing to work through proxies and fallen Jedi rather than through open invasion. 1,000 years after Naga Sadow's defeat, another Dark Lord would emerge from the shadows. His name was Exar Kun, and he was born a Jedi, not a red-skinned Sith from Korriban. He was young, brilliant, and hungry in the way that all the greatest villains are hungry, not for wealth or territory, but for understanding, for power over the fundamental nature of reality itself. He sought out the forbidden temples and tombs, descending into the darkness of Korriban to commune with the spirits of the dead lords. There in the Valley of the Dead, in the very shadow of Ajunta Paul's tomb, he encountered the spirit of Freedon Nad, a fallen Jedi who had been twisted by the dark side long ago and whose essence still lingered in the stone, waiting, patient, hungry to corrupt new hosts. The seduction of a fallen Jedi by the ghost of another fallen Jedi. There is a kind of terrible logic to it, a corruption that moves through the Order like an infection. Exar Kun, whatever his original intentions, did not resist. He became a Sith Lord in his own right, but he did something the ancient Dark Lords had not. He began to gather followers from within the Republic itself. There was a secret society called the Krath, founded by two nobles of the Empress Teta system who had discovered fragments of Sith lore and built a dark side cult around them. There was also a Jedi named Ulic Qel-Droma, who had been sent to infiltrate the Krath and destroy them from within, but who instead fell to the dark side and became Exar Kun's apprentice. And there were the Mandalorians, fierce warriors from the outer reaches, who saw in Ulic's power and Exar Kun's ambition an opportunity to test themselves in grand, brutal warfare. The war that followed consumed entire systems. It burned through the Republic's defenses and its confidence. What made it terrible was not just the scale of the violence, though there was plenty of that, but the personal treacheries, the Jedi corrupted from within, the sense that the Order itself had been infiltrated and compromised. There was a Jedi Master named Nomi Sunrider, wise and formidable, skilled in a rare ability that allowed her to sever a person's connection to the Force entirely, to silence them, to strip away the thing that made them powerful. She would become the instrument of Exar Kun's undoing. But before that reckoning came, Ulic Qel-Droma, corrupted, ambitious, lost in the dark side, murdered his own brother in combat, Ki Qel-Droma, a Jedi who had loved him and opposed him. That moment, the death of a brother at a brother's hand, broke something open in the war. Ulic, for a moment, felt the full weight of what he had become, and it moved him toward a kind of redemption, or at least toward resistance to the darkness he had embraced. When Nomi Sunrider finally confronted him, she severed his connection to the Force entirely, and the apprentice fell, no longer able to access the power that had consumed him. Exar Kun, meanwhile, had made his base on a jungle moon in the Outer Rim, among vast ancient temples built by the Masasi, a warrior caste he had enslaved to feed his dark power. When the Jedi finally assembled in overwhelming numbers and assaulted the temples, Exar Kun faced a destruction he could not escape. But in his final moments, he did something that would ripple across millennia. He bound his spirit to the very stone of the temples, trapping his essence in the darkness, refusing to die, refusing to accept the finality of defeat. His ghost would linger for thousands of years, waiting in the stone, a lesson and a curse. The Great Sith War ended, as all these wars do, with the Republic battered but standing, the Sith scattered but not eliminated. And the cycle began again. The Sith would retreat into shadow, gather power, find new hosts, new servants, new fallen Jedi to corrupt and use. The war of light and dark was not a single conflict, but a pattern, a rhythm that would shape the galaxy for millennia to come. For 1,000 years before the films, the galaxy burned in what historians would later call the New Sith Wars, and what I think of as the Sith's final, most terrible argument with itself. The Brotherhood of Darkness had risen under a Dark Lord named Khan, and it was built on an idea that sounds almost reasonable if you don't think too carefully about who was thinking it, that the Sith would stop destroying themselves if they stopped fighting over who got to be in charge. What if, Khan had asked, there were no single Dark Lord at all, no throne, no hierarchy of power with one name at the top? What if instead all the Sith Lords stood equal, calling themselves by the same title, sharing authority, and pursuing the dark side's goals together? It is the kind of thought that can occur to you when you have a great deal of power and are tired of defending it, and it seems almost generous until you realize what it really is. A lie told by the powerful to the powerless, suggesting that giving up your absolute rule somehow means equality rather than simply diffusing responsibility until no one is truly accountable for anything. The Republic, meanwhile, had raised an army of light against them, led by a Jedi named Lord Hoth, and for a long time it seemed as though this war might actually conclude, that one side or the other might finally, definitively, win. The Sith had scattered themselves across too many leaders, and the Brotherhood was vast and sprawling, and the Jedi had consolidated their strength under Hoth into something focused and terrible. The final reckoning came on a world called Ruusan, a place you should remember because it will echo through everything that follows, and the two armies met there again and again in a series of battles that ground on until the outcome seemed genuinely uncertain. There was a man in Khan's Brotherhood, a former miner from a world called Apatros, whose birth name was Dissel, and who had taken for himself the title Darth Bane. Bane was not particularly more powerful than the other Sith Lords around him, and he did not command more followers or hold more territory, but he possessed something rarer. He had the capacity to see his own order clearly without the softening of pride or desperation. He looked at the Brotherhood of Darkness, and he saw exactly what Khan's vision had actually created, not equality, but inefficiency, not unity, but camouflage for endless internal competition. He saw Sith Lords whose time was consumed with managing other Sith Lords, whose ambition was diluted between external enemies and internal rivals, whose strength was cancelled out by the strength of others. And he had studied the old teachings, the holocrons of ancient Dark Lords like Revan, tracing the history of the Sith across millennia, and he began to understand something that none of the others had been willing to face. The Sith had never failed because they were too strong, but because there were always too many of them. There's a clarity in that realization that I find myself thinking about a lot, because it requires looking at your own civilization and deciding that what has destroyed it again and again is not an external enemy, but the very thing you have been taught to value above all else, power itself, and the refusal to share it. Bane came to Khan with a plan, or what Khan believed was a plan a strategy for using the Jedi's strength against them on the fields of Ruusan, and at the heart of it was a weapon that the ancient Sith had left behind, a ritual called the Thought Bomb. The Thought Bomb was not a weapon in the sense of a ship or a cannon. It was something older and more terrible, a dark side ritual that would consume the life force, the very connection to the Force itself, of every Force-sensitive being within its radius. It would kill the Brotherhood and the Army of Light together, an indiscriminate extinction of power in one place, and Bane explained it to Khan as a necessary sacrifice, a way to break the Jedi's back by accepting terrible losses of their own. Khan, who had built the Brotherhood on the principle that they were stronger together, and who had perhaps grown tired of managing that strength, agreed. On Ruusan, as the armies met and the fighting reached its height, the Brotherhood of Darkness detonated the Thought Bomb, and in a moment that stretched beyond time, the ritual consumed nearly everything: the spirits, the life forces, the very essence of almost every Force-sensitive being in that place. The Jedi fell by the hundreds, Lord Hoth among them, their connection to the Force severed in an instant that must have felt like the death of something far larger than themselves. The Sith fell too, Khan and most of the Brotherhood, their collective power turned against them in the final argument of their collective existence. When the light faded and the ritual's hunger was sated, the fields of Ruusan were empty of the sound of lightsabers, and nearly everything the new Sith Wars had been fighting over was gone. But Darth Bane survived, because he had never truly believed in the Brotherhood, and he had positioned himself where the ritual's reach could not quite touch him, at the very edge of its hunger. In that moment of devastation, as he looked out at what the Thought Bomb had made, he understood that he had just witnessed what the Sith had needed to learn 1,000 years ago. The only way the Sith could win was to stop trying to be many and accept that they would have to be one. He had destroyed almost every other Sith Lord in the galaxy not out of hatred, though the dark side is never short of hatred, but out of a kind of terrible logic, the logic of strength selecting for itself across generations. Bane walked away from Ruusan carrying that understanding, and he carried with him a young apprentice, a girl whose name he took from history and remade into Darth Zana, and he made a decision that would reshape everything that followed. There would be only two Sith now, a master and an apprentice, and that was all. The master would hold the power and the knowledge. The apprentice would learn from the master's strength, and one day, when they were ready, when they had become stronger, they would destroy the master and take their place. This was not a rule arrived at through committee or philosophy or discussion, but through murder and ritual, and the cold observation that the Sith destroyed themselves whenever they were allowed to become many. The apprentice was meant to want to kill the master. This was not a flaw in the system, but its core function, because if the apprentice wanted it badly enough and trained hard enough and thought carefully enough, then one day the apprentice would succeed, and the Sith would have replaced the weak with the strong. And then that new master would take their own apprentice, and the cycle would begin again, an engine of selection hidden in the simplest structure imaginable. Two people, waiting in the darkness, each knowing that one of them would eventually destroy the other. I think about what this moment means a lot, because what Bane had essentially done was take everything the Sith had ever been: the hunger for power, the refusal to share it, the belief that the strong should dominate and the weak should fall, and he had weaponized it against the possibility of their own destruction. Where the Jedi saw the dark side as chaotic and self-destructive, Bane saw that it would always be those things, unless it was forced into a structure that made those qualities work toward a single, very long-term goal rather than against it. For 1,000 years, the Sith had warred with each other and the galaxy, and the story had always been the same. They rose, they fell, they fought among themselves, they were scattered, and the cycle began again. Now, standing on the fields of Ruusan, with the Thought Bomb's afterimage still burning in the Force around him, Bane had decided that there was only one way to end that cycle: by embracing it so completely, so ruthlessly, that it would eventually lead to a single, unquestionable power. Darth Zana looked to her new master and saw a man who had destroyed nearly everything, and she understood that she was meant to eventually destroy him as well. That this was not the beginning of the Sith's healing, but the beginning of something patient and terrible, and far more dangerous to the Jedi Order than anything the Brotherhood's collective power had ever been. The rule of two was born in blood and ritual on the fields of Ruusan, and it would endure for 1,000 years, a silent engine turning in the darkness, waiting. I want to tell you about a man whose name you may already know, though what you know of him might be incomplete or contradictory or wrong in ways that even the oldest archives cannot quite resolve. His name was Revan, and he was born a Jedi, trained in the Order's disciplines, taught to serve the Republic and to trust in the light. But around 4,000 years before the events we have been moving toward, Revan looked at the galaxy and saw something the Jedi Council refused to see. The Mandalorians were at war with the Republic, and the Republic was losing. The Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, led by Mandalore the Ultimate, were sweeping across the Outer Rim with a ferocity and discipline that the Republic's fleets could not match, and Revan, who possessed a gift for strategy that bordered on the preternatural, believed that if the Jedi did not intervene directly, the Republic would fall. The Council disagreed and told him to stand down, to maintain the Jedi's neutrality, to trust in the Republic's own strength. But Revan was, above all, a man of extraordinary will, and he could not accept inaction in the face of what he saw as inevitable collapse. He gathered followers, Jedi who shared his convictions, who believed that philosophy must sometimes bend to necessity, and he went to war. These came to be called the Revanchists, and under Revan's command, they turned the tide of the Mandalorian Wars with a tactical brilliance that seemed almost to defy explanation. He fought across the Rim. He learned his enemies' patterns as though he were reading their thoughts. He won battles that should have been lost, and slowly, inch by inch, he pushed the Mandalorians back. I find myself thinking about this period quite a lot, because it is a threshold moment in Revan's story, and in some sense, in the entire history of the Sith. He was still at that time a Jedi, at least in name, at least in his own understanding of himself. But he was learning what it felt like to bend the Jedi's rules, to act on conviction rather than obedience, to trust in his own judgment over the Council's authority. That is not the dark side yet, or it does not have to be, but it is the threshold of it. It is the first step away. The Mandalorian Wars culminated at Malacha V, a world whose significance would echo forward across centuries, a place that would become a scar in the Force itself. Revan and Mandalore, the Ultimate, met there, and Revan defeated him in combat, and when Mandalore fell, his followers fell with him. The Neo-Crusade collapsed like a structure whose keystone had been removed. But the victory came at a cost that was almost beyond measure. The Republic had deployed a superweapon at Malacha V called the Mass Shadow Generator, a weapon that used the Force itself as a trigger that created a kind of gravity singularity powerful enough to crush entire fleets. When Revan gave the order to activate it, both the Mandalorian fleet and his own fleet were caught in its radius, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed in an instant, crushed to nothing by weaponized gravity, by technology that weaponized the very fabric of space. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it matters. Revan won the war, and in winning it, he committed what might reasonably be called genocide, and he did this because the alternative was to lose. The Jedi Code teaches that compassion and the preservation of life are paramount, that the weak must be protected, that sacrifice is noble, but not that others should be sacrificed for you. The dark side teaches that strength is the only measure of worth, and that the strong are justified in whatever they must do to endure. Standing in the aftermath of Malacha V, watching the sensor readings, understanding that he had just killed hundreds of thousands of his own soldiers to secure victory, Revan was confronted with a question that has no easy answer. What does it mean to be a hero? What he did next, we know from the records, was to venture with his apprentice Malak into the unknown regions, beyond the borders of the Republic, into spaces that the Jedi did not map, and the Republic did not claim. And there, in the darkness between stars, they encountered the Sith Empire, and they encountered the Sith Emperor, a being of terrible age and terrible power, a remnant of an older darkness that had never truly been defeated, only hidden away to gather strength. This is where the narrative becomes uncertain, becomes a matter of interpretation rather than verifiable fact. Some records suggest that Revan and Malak were corrupted, that they fell to the dark side through the Emperor's influence, through exposure to Sith teachings ancient and elaborate beyond the Jedi's understanding. Other accounts suggest that Revan strategically converted to the dark side as a means of learning the Emperor's secrets, that it was an infiltration that became something else. The truth, I suspect, is that the distinction between these explanations is not as clean as we would like it to be. Revan discovered, in the unknown regions, something that his experiences at Malacha V had prepared him to understand, that the Sith were not wrong about strength. They were incomplete, and they were cruel, and their philosophy consumed itself. But they were not wrong about the utility of power, about the reality that in a universe without gods, strength is the closest thing to truth. Revan returned to the Republic as Darth Revan, a dark lord of the Sith, and he waged what came to be called the Jedi Civil War, and he conquered a significant portion of the galaxy. And for a time, it seemed possible that the Sith, hidden for so long, would finally succeed in their ancient goal of overthrowing the Republic and ruling openly. But Revan's story does not end there, because Revan's story is, above all things, a story about transformation, about the capacity to change, even when change seems impossible. Malak, hungry for power, betrayed his master. He attacked Revan's ship as it was surrounded by a Jedi strike team, and he did this knowing that it might kill Revan, knowing that if Revan fell, Malak would be able to claim the title of Dark Lord for himself. The betrayal worked, after a fashion. Revan was gravely wounded, captured, and brought before the Jedi Council, and the Council, rather than executing him or trying to redeem him through dialogue, chose instead to wipe his mind, to implant a false identity, to turn him into a tool to be used against Malak and the Star Forge. And yet somewhere inside that fractured, reconstructed mind, something of the true Revan remained, and eventually, slowly, that true self re-emerged, and Revan, remembering who he was and understanding what he had become, chose to turn back toward the light. This is perhaps the most important part of his story, though it is rarely emphasized. The Sith Order, as we have seen, is built on the assumption that once someone has fallen to the dark side, they remain fallen, that darkness is a gravity well from which nothing can escape. Revan escaped. He returned to himself, recovered his true name and his true face, and he defeated Malak at the Star Forge and destroyed the ancient weapon that had brought both of them to power. And he did this as a Jedi, or at least as someone who had chosen, once again, to serve the light. But Revan did not stop there. Having defeated Malak and understood the true nature of the threat that existed in the unknown regions, Revan understood that the Sith Emperor still lived, still gathered power, still represented an extinction-level threat to the Republic. So Revan departed once more into the unknown regions, and this time he did not return, at least not in any way that the historical record has been able to preserve. There are theories that he discovered the Emperor and fought him, that he fell again, that he became something else entirely, that he is still alive somewhere, waiting. But the honest answer is that Revan simply vanished, and in vanishing, he became something more powerful than he could have been if he had stayed. He became a mystery, a possibility, a figure that every Jedi who came after him could contemplate and wonder about, a question mark at the heart of the Republic's history. I think about Revan a lot, because his story is perhaps the clearest illustration of the choice at the heart of all of this. You can fall, and you can do terrible things, and you can serve darkness, and still, if you choose, if you fight hard enough, you can come home to yourself. There is something in that matters. Revan vanished into the unknown regions, and in that absence, something shifted in the galaxy that no one quite saw coming until it was already too late. His apprentice, a young man named Alec who had once been called Squint in the halls of the Jedi Temple, looked at the empty throne and understood that it was now his. Malak, for that was the name he had taken when he fell, had always been ambitious in a way that burned differently than Revan's ambition, which had been cold and strategic and certain. Revan had wanted to remake the galaxy according to a vision. Malak simply wanted to consume it, to take every particle of power and authority and draw it into himself until there was nothing left but hunger satisfied. In the early days of their fall together, this had been an advantage under Revan's command. That hunger had made him useful, dangerous, a blade that did not question or hesitate. But blades, I have always thought, do not enjoy being wielded by other hands. When Revan's flagship hung crippled in the void, and the Jedi strike team closed in, Malak made his choice with the kind of brutal clarity that defined him. He ordered the guns of his own vessel to fire upon the bridge where his master stood, a betrayal so sudden and so total that it might have seemed to come from nowhere if you did not understand the calculus of the dark side. The dark side does not punish betrayal. It is, in a real sense, the only form of advancement it knows. Revan fell, and Malak rose, and the war that had been waged in the name of one Dark Lord was suddenly, irrevocably, the war of another. What Malak inherited was not simply an army or an empire, but a weapon unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory, the Star Forge. I want you to understand what this machine was, because it matters to everything that follows. Hidden in a system in the unknown regions known as Lehon, lost to the wider galaxy for thousands of years, the Star Forge was a relic of the Rakata Infinite Empire, a civilization so ancient and so powerful that they had treated the dark side like an architect treats stone, as a material to be shaped and used. Revan and Malak had discovered it, and in discovering it, they had found the means to wage a war that the Jedi Order could not possibly survive. The Star Forge did not manufacture weapons in the way ordinary shipyards do, with the slow accumulation of materials and the careful labor of time. It fed on the dark side itself. It drew strength from suffering and pain and the life force of those who surrounded it, and in exchange, it produced an endless stream of warships and droids and fighters that poured into the Sith war machine like blood from an inexhaustible wound. Malak understood this weapon in a way that I think even Revan, for all his brilliance, had not quite grasped. He did not see it as a tool to be used judiciously, as a means to an end. He saw it as an extension of his own hunger, a mouth that could feed endlessly as long as he kept feeding it. And so the war that had been fought with strategy and cunning under Revan's command became something else entirely under Malak. It became consumption. The worlds that fell to him did not fall to military superiority alone, though the fleets born from the Star Forge certainly provided that, but to the simple terror of facing an enemy that could not be exhausted, that could replace any loss instantly, that seemed to multiply its forces even as you destroyed them. He attacked Dantooine, where the Jedi had established an academy, and he left nothing but ashes and the echo of screams. He turned his attention to Telos IV, a world that had the misfortune of being loyal to the Republic, and he bombed it from orbit until the surface was scarred and the sky wept with ash. These were not strategic calculations. They were hunger made manifest, the dark side's philosophy of absolute domination translated into the language of total war. There is something in the records of this period that troubles me, the accounts of what Malak did with the Jedi he captured. The Star Forge required constant feeding, and Jedi, beings resonant with the Force, thick with connection and life and light, were exactly what it hungered for. Malak kept them prisoner aboard the great weapon, men and women who had once been teachers and guardians, and he bound them there so that the Star Forge could drain them slowly, drawing out their life essence, their connection to the Force, until there was nothing left but husks and the faint echo of screams. It was cruelty, certainly, but but it was also efficiency, and Malak never quite distinguished between the two. There was one more thing that I think reveals something essential about Malak's reign, about what separated it from Revan's vision. He had a prisoner named Bastila Shan, a Jedi Knight of rare gift, a woman whose connection to battle meditation, the ability to coordinate Starfleet movements through the Force itself, made her valuable beyond measure. Instead of executing her or draining her as he did the others, Malak kept her alive and close, and he subjected her to years of torture designed not to kill, but to break, to turn, to convert her to the dark side and make her his own apprentice, his own weapon. I want you to sit with that choice for a moment, because it says something about what Malak believed power was. It was not enough for him to defeat his enemies. He needed to own them, to corrupt them, to transform them into reflections of his own darkness. It was a kind of hunger that went beyond mere destruction. It was the hunger to consume not just bodies but souls, and I think that distinction matters. Revan had waged war to conquer and reshape. Malak waged war because war itself was the only form of existence he could tolerate. For 3 years, he held the Jedi Order at the edge of collapse. The Star Forge's fleets moved from world to world, and the Jedi could not match them. The weapons could not be exhausted, the enemy could not be demoralized, the pattern could not be broken. It seemed, in that dark moment, that Malak might actually succeed where even Revan had not, that he might actually extinguish the light that had endured for millennia. But there is something about hunger, I have come to believe, that blinds even the hungriest to what is moving in the darkness around them. Malak did not understand that his master had not truly vanished, that Revan's thread was still connected to the tapestry of fate in ways even the dark side could not fully sever. He did not see that the Jedi Order, while battered and near to breaking, was still searching, still moving, still alive in ways that the Star Forge's hunger could not quite consume. And he did not see that betrayal, that greatest virtue of the dark side, was about to be visited upon him in a form he would never expect. The war that Malak had inherited would become, in the end, the war that would consume him. During the Mandalorian Wars, when Revan's fleets pushed deeper into the unknown regions in pursuit of Mandalore the Ultimate, they did not find what they expected. Not simple victory, not the clean end of a military campaign, but something far stranger. A breadcrumb trail left by a civilization that had died 30,000 years before. The trail was made of star maps, ancient Rakata artifacts scattered across 5 different worlds like a message, in a bottle left by someone who knew their empire would fall. Dantooine held one map, hidden where only a Force sensitive would know to look. Tatooine held another, buried in the sands. Kashyyyk, Manon, and Korriban each guarded a piece of the puzzle, as if the Rakata had wanted their greatest achievement to be found, but only by those strong enough to deserve it. The Rakata themselves had been something unprecedented, a species touched by the Force, capable of weaving it into the very fabric of their machinery, so that technology and mysticism were indistinguishable in their hands. They had built an infinite empire that spanned the galaxy for 20,000 years, and in the height of their power, at the peak of what one civilization could accomplish, they had constructed a weapon. The Star Forge, they called it, and it orbited a world named Lehon at the edge of known space, a machine so vast and so hungry that it seemed almost alive. I find myself thinking about the moment when Revan first saw it, a construct that hung in space like a predator at rest, a thing that could birth warships from nothing, that could turn raw matter and raw energy into an endless army. The Forge did not build ships the way a shipyard builds them, with time and labor and limitation. It drew power directly from the star it orbited, and it drew power from something else, from the dark side of the Force itself, from the passion and hunger and ambition of those who commanded it. The more darkness a user poured into it, the more it would produce, as if it were not a machine, but a valve that opened wider the darker you became. For Revan and Malak, standing before such a thing after years of war, After seeing what the Jedi Council would not see and fighting what the Jedi Order would not fight, the temptation was absolute. Here was the answer to every strategic problem, every moment of doubt, every instance where the Republic's slow bureaucracy had hampered their campaign, a weapon that could end everything. And here, too, was the Sith Emperor, who had been waiting in the unknown regions for generations, patient as stone, watching for exactly this moment. The Sith Emperor did not conquer Revan and Malak with argument or with force alone. He showed them the Star Forge, and in showing them, he offered them what the Jedi Order never would, the promise of absolute power without the burden of restraint. Revan fell first, or perhaps it is more accurate to say that Revan chose to fall, making a calculation that seemed logical at the time and would spend the rest of his life trying to undo. Malak followed, but where Revan was careful and strategic, Malak was hungry in a way that consumed him like a fire. The two Dark Lords returned to known space with the power of the Star Forge behind them, and the Jedi Civil War began in earnest. What they unleashed was something the Republic had never encountered. A fleet so vast that it seemed infinite, warships pouring out of the unknown regions in endless waves, each one crewed and armed, and ready to die for a master who had promised them strength. The Forge did not run out of resources. It could not be starved into submission the way a normal fleet could be. Every day that Malak controlled it, it grew more powerful. There is something almost poetic about it, I think, that the solution to the Sith problem, that collective strength, requires singular control, turned out to require a machine that literally rewarded you for sinking deeper into darkness. The Sith had tried before to enforce unity through strength, through hierarchies and Dark Lords and elaborate codes of power, and it had never worked. The dark side corrodes all structures it touches, turning every alliance into a hierarchy and every hierarchy into an opportunity for betrayal. But the Star Forge was different, because it made singular power practical in a way philosophy never could. One person or two people or three, they did not matter. What mattered was the Forge, endless and absolute, producing without limit or mercy. When Malak seized control from Revan, he did not diminish the Sith's power. If anything, he made it more terrible, because now the engine of destruction answered to one voice alone, and that voice belonged to someone who understood hunger better than any Dark Lord before or since. The Rakata who built the Forge had understood, perhaps, that such a weapon could not be controlled forever. Their empire had collapsed anyway, dissolved by plague and internal rot, and the strange fragility that seems to attend all absolute power. By the time of Malak's war, only remnants of the Rakata survived on Lehon itself, tribal people who had regressed to spear and bone, who had forgotten the machines that their ancestors had commanded, who sometimes looked up at the great structure in the sky and felt a longing they could not name. And Malak, for all his hunger, did not see that the Forge was already beginning to turn on him, that the dark side is never truly a tool but always a master, that power drawn from feeding oneself on the Force itself will eventually feed back on you. The Jedi understood this in a way that Malak, in his hunger, could not afford to understand. That is perhaps what saved them, not superior strength, not greater numbers, but the knowledge that some weapons are not meant to be wielded, that some truths about power are paid for in blood and memory. Revan, when he returned to the light, understood this too, though the price of understanding it was nearly everything he was. For now, let us sit with the Star Forge as it was in its terrible glory, a machine of infinite appetite, orbiting a distant star, waiting to be commanded by the next Dark Lord who would believe they could master it without being mastered in turn. There is a moment, I think, in every redemption story where the person who fell must look directly at what they became and decide if they can bear to become something else. Revan stood in the darkness of the Star Forge, a weapon so vast that stars themselves seemed small inside it, and the decision before him was not abstract or distant. It was immediate, and it was his. He had come to this place without memory, a soldier reborn into the light by hands that had once tried to remake him into a tool of the dark. And as his memory returned, piece by piece, like a hand closing around something precious and terrible, he began to understand. The person the Jedi Council had tried to erase was not evil because he had made evil choices, but because those choices had been his own, and his own will was precisely what they had taken from him. The path back to the light for Revan was not a path of atonement so much as a path of reclamation, of taking back the choice that others had stolen. Malak, meanwhile, had never understood this. Malak, who had once been Alec, a young Jedi who followed Revan into the Mandalorian Wars, had fallen to the dark side not because he chose power in some abstract sense, but because he wanted Revan's power specifically. The apprenticeship had curdled into hunger, the hunger into obsession, the obsession into the need to consume the master entirely. When Revan's flagship had been disabled above Lehon, when the Star Forge's defenses had crippled the vessel and left it helpless, Malak had not hesitated to fire upon his own master's ship, not to disable it, but to destroy it utterly. The lower half of Malak's jaw, you understand, had been seared away in the backlash of that act, a wound that had never fully healed, replaced with a prosthetic of pale metal and dark side scar tissue. Every time he spoke, he carried the mark of his betrayal in his mouth. And the thing about Malak was that he did not regret it. He had ruled for 3 years with the Star Forge beneath him, and he had poured everything into it. Every captured Jedi, every world he had destroyed, every life he had drained through the dark side, trying to feed the thing that would make him unstoppable. The Star Forge had grown fat on his darkness, and Malak had grown thin, hollowed out, sustained only by the momentum of his hunger and the false hope that the next Jedi drained, the next world consumed, would finally be enough. But it was never enough. There is something almost pitiable in it, if you let yourself look at it that way, the way the dark side promises to fill you and instead only makes you more empty. Revan did let himself look at it that way. When Revan and the crew of the Ebon Hawk, Bastila, who had been his anchor and his burden, Karth, the soldier looking for a way home, Mission, practical and young, Zalbar, massive and loyal, Juhani, who had walked her own path away from darkness, even HK-47, the assassin droid with his own terrible logic. When they came to Korriban, the ancient Sith tomb world, they were not going there to be reborn. They were going there to acknowledge what had already been born inside them and choose what to do with it. On Korriban, in the darkness beneath the earth, Revan accessed the star maps not as a dark side user hungry for power, but as a man trying to understand what he had touched and what it had made him. The maps led them to Lehon, to the unknown world where the Star Forge hung in the void like a cancer, and there Revan was forced to confront not his past, but his present. The possibility that even now, even knowing what he had done, he might choose the dark side again. The temptation is worth dwelling on because it was real. The dark side is not attractive because it is obviously evil. It is attractive because it promises clarity, because it offers an immediate answer to the question, what do I deserve? And the answer it gives is always everything, because you are strong enough to take it. For a man like Revan, who had been remade without his consent, who had been given a new identity and a new purpose by people who claimed to be his allies, the dark side's offer of absolute self-determination had a particular kind of weight. The Jedi Council had taken his choice away. The dark side offered to give it back. But Revan, and this is the thing that made his redemption something more than simple narrative reversal, Revan understood that this too was a kind of theft. The dark side did not offer genuine choice. It offered only the illusion of it, the chance to pretend that your will was autonomous while every passion, every rage, every hunger was orchestrated by something older and darker than you could name. So he chose not to fill the emptiness with darkness, but to walk through it. Bastila, who had been corrupted and turned Sith through Malak's cruelty, stood before him on the Star Forge, and Revan did not defeat her through superior power or the strength of his conviction. He reached for her through the force bond they shared, The same bond that had healed him when the Jedi captured him. The same bond that had haunted her as Malak tortured and twisted her toward darkness. And he asked her simply to come back. There is a gentleness in that which I find myself thinking about a lot. Bastila, who had every reason to despise him, because his fall had led to her capture, his darkness had drawn her toward her own, chose to believe that redemption was possible not because it was logical, but because Revan offered it as truth, as an actual choice, not a command. And when Malak came, the duel between them was not a clash of wills or a battle for supremacy. It was a moment where one man had to watch another look directly at emptiness and decide to keep walking toward it anyway. Malak tried to drain the Jedi prisoners aboard the Star Forge, to feed on their life force and make himself invulnerable, but Revan was not trying to overpower him through the dark side. He was trying to cut him off from it. The Star Forge itself, that infinite machine of destruction, could not be destroyed by the same will that had made it powerful. It could only be unmade by someone willing to walk away from what it offered, the promise of unlimited strength, unlimited dominion, unlimited hunger. When Revan struck Malak down, he did not do it because he was stronger. He did it because he had learned how to be weak in a way that mattered. The Star Forge collapsed, imploded, its vast machinery turning inward upon itself, not destroyed by an enemy, but simply abandoned, left without the hunger to sustain it. And Malak fell, still trying to feed, still reaching for the power that had already left him. The Jedi Civil War was over. 3 years of devastation, worlds burned, Jedi hunted, the Republic brought to the edge of collapse. All of it ended by a man who had chosen to remember who he was, and then chosen to become someone else. Revan had been given a second life by the Jedi, a false life built on amnesia and suppressed memory. He had reclaimed his first life through understanding and choice. And then understanding that the Sith Emperor still existed somewhere in the unknown regions, that the darkness was not truly ended, but only paused, Revan left the galaxy behind once more, not running, but walking forward into the unknown, carrying what he had learned back toward the source of his fall, hoping that one man, changed, might be enough to prevent the same pattern from happening again. 5 years have passed since Revan defeated Malak aboard the Star Forge, and the galaxy is learning to breathe again in the quiet that followed. But there are some who did not learn to breathe easily, because the wound left behind was not one that simple victory could close. Her name was Mitra Surik, and she had been a general in the Mandalorian Wars, a brilliant tactician who followed Revan into that terrible conflict when the Jedi Council forbade it. She had fought at Malacha V, the final battle, where a superweapon called the Mass Shadow Generator, designed by her companion Baudur, was used to collapse the planet itself and crush both the Mandalorian fleet and the Republic forces gathered there in one catastrophic moment. Hundreds of thousands of people died in that instant, their deaths so sudden and so overwhelming that they created something unprecedented in the Force. She felt them all leave at once. The sheer weight of so many lives ending in the same moment, the flood of Force energy released all at once, was too much for any consciousness to bear, and Surik's mind made a choice, not consciously, but with the certainty of instinct. She severed herself from the Force entirely, cutting herself off from that vast ocean of agony, the way someone might clap their hands over their ears in the middle of a scream. It saved her life. It may also have broken something in her that no amount of healing could quite repair. After Malacha V, she returned to the Jedi Council on Dantooine, and they looked at her and saw something they had never encountered before, a being whose relationship to the Force was inverted, turned inside out. She did not draw power from the Force in the way a Jedi should. Instead, the Force flowed toward her, as if she were a void that needed filling. The Council, in their wisdom and their fear, made a choice. They exiled her, though she walked away willingly, accepting their judgment as something necessary and right. And so she became the Exile, a Jedi who was no Jedi, a Force sensitive whose sensitivity had been weaponized against her own nature. 5 years later, in 3951 of the Old Republic calendar, the Exel was aboard a ship called the Harbinger when something pulled her attention outward, toward a disturbance she could not quite name. It was not quite pain, not quite awareness, but something in between, a wrongness in the galactic order that whispered to her of something vast and terrible that had been set in motion. In some way, though she could not have known it yet, she was sensitive to the absence itself, the void left behind when Malak had died, and the power structure of the Sith Order had, for a moment, collapsed entirely. The galaxy had become, in that moment, incomplete. 3 Dark Lords rose to fill the space that Malak's death had left open. Darth Nihilus, whose hunger consumed entire worlds and the Force energy within them. Darth Sion, a being of pure pain and hatred held together by rage. And Darth Kreia, the ancient manipulator who had been cast out and betrayed by the very apprentices she meant to use. The Jedi Order, already shattered by Malak's war, was being hunted now with methodical, patient cruelty. The Jedi Master Atris, who had collected Sith holocrons and studied the enemy to understand them, had gathered the surviving Jedi to a hidden enclave, and it was there that Nihilus found them, drawn by the concentration of Force energy, the way a predator is drawn by blood in the water. He consumed them all, erased them from the Force itself, leaving Atris broken and alone in her vault of forbidden knowledge. Mitra Surik, cut off from the Force as she was, may have been the only Jedi who survived, because she could not be found in the way the Sith searched for their prey. Her wound was, in a strange and terrible way, her salvation. I find myself thinking about this often, the way that what breaks us can sometimes be the only thing that stands between us and oblivion. The Exel carried inside her a void in the Force itself, something that made her paradoxical. She could not feel the Force as other Jedi felt it, and yet she was somehow more sensitive to its absence, to the way it moved and shifted in response to great darkness. When others sensed danger through the light of the Force, she sensed it through the cold of its withdrawal. When the 3 Sith Lords rose to consolidate their power, when Nihilus began to consume worlds and Sion began to hunt, when Kreia moved through the shadows with her hidden agenda, the Exel felt these things not as bright warnings, but as silences where warnings should have been. It is a lonely way to perceive the galaxy. The normal channels of the Force were closed to her, and what remained was something stranger, more isolated, a direct knowledge of absence, of hunger, of the void itself. She was 5 years into her exile when the Harbinger found her, drawn perhaps by that same silence that drew the Sith, and everything that had been waiting since Malacha V began to move again. The Jedi Council had made their judgment, and she had accepted it, but the Force itself, or what remained of her connection to it, had other plans. The wound in the galaxy left by Malak's defeat would need to be understood, walked through, and in the end, perhaps healed, and only a being who was herself a wound could hope to do such a thing. There is something in that. The broken are sometimes the only ones who can navigate a broken world. The Exel stood at the threshold of a darkness she did not yet understand, sensitive to absences she could not name, carrying inside her the memory of 500,000 deaths and the terrible gift they had given her, the ability to feel the galaxy die. In the aftermath of Naga Sado's defeat at the Battle of Korriban, something remarkable happened. The Sith did not simply vanish, as the Jedi had once believed they would. Scattered across the galaxy, surviving Dark Lords fled into the depths of space, into regions that no Republic charts had ever properly named, driven by a hunger that defeat could not extinguish. Some retreated to Yavin 4 with Sado himself, where the Masasi, those enslaved warrior caste descendants of the ancient Sith species, built temples of staggering scale and darkness, each stone mortared with rage and the memory of conquest. Others dispersed further still, into the unknown regions, that vast unmapped frontier where ships could travel for months and encounter nothing but void and the terrible clarity of isolation. What strikes me about this period, as I contemplate it, is the quietness of it. There were no grand wars during these centuries, no apocalyptic confrontations between light and dark, the kind that history remembers with monuments. Instead, there was scattering, dispersal, a slow seeping of darkness into pockets of the galaxy where the Jedi's light could not easily reach. And in that quietness, something patient was taking root. The surviving Sith Lords, driven into isolation, stripped of the organized hierarchy that Ajunta Paul had once established, began a process of transformation that would take centuries to complete. Each Dark Lord, separated from the others, pursued power in solitude, experimenting with Sith alchemy in hidden chambers, studying the holocrons they had managed to preserve, the recorded teachings of those who had fallen before them. They were, in a sense, waiting. Not passively, but with the focused hunger that defines the dark side. A hunger that does not require an enemy to sustain itself, only an object for that hunger to consume. On Korriban itself, the ancient Valley of the Dark Lords remained a place of pilgrimage, though now it was a tomb rather than a seat of empire. The tombs of Dark Lords lay sealed in the vast sepulchres Ajunta Paul had ordered built thousands of years before, and the surviving Sith, scattered as they were, understood that Korriban was still sacred to them, still a place where the dark side flowed through the very stone and soil. But they could not return openly, not while the Jedi remained watchful, not while the Republic still hunted the remnants of the Empire. So Korriban became something quieter and stranger, a place of echoes, a monument to a power that had been broken but not destroyed, waiting in darkness for the generation that would dare reclaim it. In those centuries of dispersion, one figure began to move among the scattered survivors with a purpose that seemed to transcend mere ambition. His name was Vitiate, and he was old even then, though how old, even the records do not precisely say. Vitiate was unlike the Sith Lords who had come before him. He did not seek to build an empire through conquest, or to gather armies under his banner, or even to dominate through the sheer force of personality that had characterized figures like Naga Sado. Instead, he gathered the surviving Dark Lords to a place of terrible power, the world of Nathema, an ancient Sith stronghold, a place that had been sacred since the deepest antiquity. What Vitiate did there is something that even now, with all the knowledge we possess, carries a weight of profound transgression. He conducted a ritual, a working of Sith sorcery so vast and so consuming that it consumed an entire world. Everything on Nathema died. The trees, the animals, the oceans, the very soil itself became barren and lifeless, and all of that death, all of that extinguished potential, all of that snuffed-out presence in the Force was drawn into a single being, into Vitiate himself. I find myself hesitating when I consider this moment, because it represents a crossing of a threshold from which there is genuinely no return. The Jedi speak of balance, of harmony with the Force, of using the Force rather than being used by it. What Vitiate accomplished was the inverse of every principle the Jedi held sacred. He did not use the Force. He consumed it, drew it into himself, became something other than human or Sith in the traditional sense. A vessel of ambition and darkness so profound that it began to touch on something almost alien. The other Sith Lords who participated in that ritual, or who witnessed it, understood that they had entered the presence of something that transcended their own understanding of power. And in that understanding, something shifted in the landscape of Sith philosophy. If one being could achieve such transcendence through such consumption, then perhaps the endless feuding, the constant competition between Dark Lords of equal standing, was itself a form of weakness. Perhaps power was not meant to be shared at all. Vitiate took the survivors, those Dark Lords who had not been consumed in the ritual, who had survived into the wake of that terrible working, and led them away from Republic space entirely, deeper into the unknown regions than any Sith had ventured before. He established a new seat of power on the world of Dromund Kars, a planet hidden in the depths of unexplored space, where the veil between the physical world and the dark side grew thin and strange. There, on Drummond cars, Vitiate ordered the construction of a new capital, a new temple to house the darkest teachings of the Sith, a fortress from which the reconstituted Sith Empire could one day emerge to finish what Naga Sado had begun. But that emergence would not come quickly. The rule of two, that patient, terrible system that would eventually define Sith existence, had not yet been established. For now, the Sith existed in a state somewhere between Empire and Shadow, neither fully dissolved nor fully organized, a gathering of isolated Dark Lords who acknowledged Vitiate as something greater than themselves, but who still competed, still hunted, still pursued their own dark ambitions in the corners of known space. Centuries passed in this way. The Jedi, believing the Sith threat had been permanently ended by their victories, gradually lowered their vigilance. New Jedi were born and trained. The memory of the wars against the Sith became history, then legend, then something half-believed, a cautionary tale told to apprentices about the dangers of falling to the dark side. And beneath all of that, in the unknown regions, in hidden temples and isolated fortresses scattered across unmapped space, the Sith endured. They did not grow as rapidly as they might have wished. They did not gather strength for open war. Instead, they accumulated power in silence, corrupted worlds in obscurity, preserved knowledge in holocrons, and waited for the moment when circumstances would again align to permit their emergence. There is something almost unbearably sad about this period when I consider it. The patience of the predator, the hunger sustained across centuries, the knowledge that defeat is merely a pause, not an ending. The Jedi had won their wars, and the Republic had celebrated, and the galaxy had seemed to settle into a new and more stable existence. But in the quiet places, in the darkness between the stars, something older and colder and more patient was stirring. And it would not forget. It would wait as long as necessary. It would wait until the moment was right, until the circumstances permitted it to emerge and finish what it had begun so long ago. In the years after Malak's defeat, when the Star Forge had collapsed into ash and silence, something new began to move in the darkness. Not the remnants of Malak's appetite, but something stranger, something that could only exist in the absence he left behind. The Sith Order, which had been reduced to a single line of master and apprentice under Bane's rule of two, suddenly fractured into three separate beings, each one powerful enough to stand alone, each one embodying a different face of the dark side. They rose not from a central power, but from different corners of the galaxy, unknown to each other at first, drawn together by what they sensed in the Force. A void, a hunger, a breaking point where something ancient was about to be reborn. The first of them was Kreia, and if you listen carefully to what she actually was, you begin to understand why three Sith could rise where only two should exist under the rule of two, and why her presence would fracture everything that came after. Kreia had once been a Jedi Master, a teacher of some reputation, and then, like so many threads in this story, she had been exiled, cast out by the Order for reasons the historical record does not fully clarify, though the implication seems to be that she knew something, believed something, that the Council could not tolerate. She did not fall to the dark side as a sudden act of violence or hunger, the way Malak had. Instead, she moved toward it slowly, intellectually, the way someone walks into a room and realizes only after several steps that the light has changed. What Kreia discovered in the dark side was not power in the traditional sense, though she possessed that too. She discovered a kind of clarity, a vision of how all things were connected through deception, through layers of manipulation that went deeper than anyone had thought to look. She took the name Darth Treya, which means Lady of Betrayal, and it is worth sitting with that choice for a moment, because betrayal, in her philosophy, was not a personal failing. It was the fundamental architecture of existence itself. Everything betrays everything else, she believed. The Force betrays those who serve it. Masters betray their apprentices. The strong betray the weak by crushing them. and the only clarity available to anyone was to see that pattern and stop pretending it was anything other than what it was. The second figure who emerged from the void was Darth Nihilus, and his origin was bound up with Malacha V, that terrible place where so many had died to the mass shadow generator. When Mitra Surik activated the weapon, a cascade of gravitational force that murdered hundreds of thousands of people in an instant, something happened that no one had predicted. The death was so sudden, so massive, so concentrated in a single location that it tore a wound in the force itself. Nihilus was there, or rather, a being that would become Nihilus was there, and he did not die the way the others did. Instead, he passed through the wound and emerged transformed, hollowed out, turned into something that could only be described as hunger given shape. He became a Sith not through study or philosophy, but through accident, through proximity to catastrophe, and his entire being thereafter was devoted to one single impulse: to feed, to consume, to draw in the life energy of everything around him the way a void draws in matter. There is something almost pitiable in that, and I think that's important to sit with. Nihilus was not evil in the way the earlier Sith Lords were evil. He was broken, and his brokenness expressed itself as hunger, as a need so absolute that it consumed his will entirely. He could devour planets, draw the life from entire worlds until they were silent and empty and grey, and he would feel the moment of that consumption as a kind of pleasure, a fraction of a second where the void was satisfied before it yawned open again. Visas Ma, one of the last survivors of the planet Qatar after Nihilus consumed it, became something like a servant to him, bound to him by the very horror of her survival. She alone had lived while billions died, and that asymmetry anchored her to him in ways neither of them fully understood. The third Sith was Darth Sion, and he too bore the scars of Malacha V, though they were written on his body rather than in the structure of his being. Sion was ancient, a survivor of older wars, and he had been broken repeatedly across centuries. His body was a collection of fractures and failures held together by something that conventional medicine or even conventional dark side knowledge could not explain. What held Sion together was pure will, pure hatred, the refusal to die even though by every law of biology and physics he should have been dead 1,000 times over. He had learned, across ages of suffering, that pain itself could be weaponized, that if you hated hard enough and long enough, you could make your ruined body obey you. There is something almost noble in that defiance, I find, even as we acknowledge how completely it had twisted him. Sion's suffering had become his entire identity, and he had begun to believe that his suffering was the only thing about him that was real. These three, Treya the betrayer, Nihilus the hungry void, and Sion the keeper of pain, began to work together, though together is perhaps too generous a word for what happened between them. Kreia brought them structure and knowledge. She showed them how to hunt the remaining Jedi, how to sense them across the galaxy, how to close every escape route and silence every voice that still carried the light side of the Force. Nihilus and Sion, meanwhile, hungered in their different ways. One for the Force energy of living beings, the other for domination, for the subjugation of everything that breathed, for the confirmation that his will could override reality itself. They gathered at Malacha V, at the ruins of what had once been the Mandalorian War's final battlefield, and Kreia established an academy there, the Treyas Academy, where she began teaching her two most powerful apprentices the depths of what she believed, the philosophy that the Force itself was a tyrant, that all beings were slaves to it, and that true power lay in breaking its chains. But even as they worked together, the original flaw of the Sith reasserted itself. They were three predators sharing the same territory, each one powerful enough to want more power, each one capable of taking it. Kreia, for all her brilliance, found herself outmaneuvered by the hunger of her own creations. Nihilus and Sion betrayed her, cast her aside, and took the Treyas Academy and Malacha V for themselves, leaving her to exile once more, stripped of her most direct sources of power. And there is something almost fitting in that too, something that circles back to the very philosophy she had been teaching them. Betrayal, she believed, was inevitable. It was the fundamental truth of the dark side, and yet when it happened to her, it still hurt. The Triumvirate, these three wounded, powerful, broken beings, became the most dangerous force the Jedi Order would face in the final age, more coordinated than the scattered Sith of previous centuries, and yet more fractured, more bent toward their own individual hungers than any unified Sith empire had ever been. They hunted methodically, quietly across years, and the Jedi Order, already nearly extinct from Malak's reign, began to fall silent, one by one, until the galaxy itself seemed emptied of the light. At Malacha V, when the mass shadow generator tore through the fabric of the Force itself, something was born in that wound that should never have been born. Not a Sith Lord in the way we have come to understand them, not a being with ambitions, or a face, or a voice that could be reasoned with, but something closer to a hunger given shape. Nihilus was there when it happened, or became there, or was made there. The accounts grow unclear because Nihilus himself seems unclear, a person slowly hollowed out from the inside until nothing remained but appetite. What we know is this: he survived the detonation of the mass shadow generator, but survival is perhaps the wrong word for what occurred, because to survive you must remain yourself, and Nihilus ceased to be himself the moment the device discharged. The wound in the Force, the same void that had marked Mitra Surik when she severed herself from the current flowing through all living things, found in Nihilus something different, not a rupture but a doorway, and he stepped through it and did not come back. I find myself thinking about hunger a great deal when I consider Nihilus, and not the hunger for food or power or revenge, the ordinary hungers that drive most beings, even most Sith. This was hunger at the level of being itself, a need so fundamental, so without end, that it could only be satisfied by consuming the Force from everything around him, the life energy from worlds, the presence from peoples, until there was nothing left but him and the emptiness that had made him. He could not speak because speech requires a self distinct enough from other things to have opinions, preferences, words of its own. Instead, his language was a cascade of distorted syllables, a sound like a throat full of razors, utterly incomprehensible and utterly sincere. When he wore his white mask marked with red, when he dressed in the black robes of a Sith Lord, those were gestures toward being something recognizable, some echo of the civilization that had made him, but they were only gestures, the clothes of a ghost. Kreia found him, or he found her, or they found each other in the darkness of what Malacha V had become, and for a time she believed she could teach him, could shape this wound into a weapon, this hunger into a purpose. She was wrong, and there is something almost gentle in the recognition of that, the way Kreia discovered that even she, with all her knowledge and manipulation, had met something that could not be reasoned with because it had no self to reason with. Nihilus and Sion turned on her together, and she understood then what she had truly discovered. Not disciples, but forces of nature, catastrophes wearing the shape of Sith Lords, and she was cast aside. The hunger that was Nihilus moved through the galaxy like a wound opening, and worlds began to die not to conquest or plague or rebellion, but to simple consumption. He would arrive in orbit, and the life would drain from the surface below as though a mouth had opened in the sky and begun to swallow. The Force present in every living creature, every tree, every insect, drawn up and inward into the vast emptiness that had become his only nature. Qatar was the greatest of these feedings, and I want to linger on it because there is something in that death that speaks to what Nihilus had become. The Meraluka were a species who saw not with eyes, but through the Force itself, their perception woven entirely into the flow of connection that binds all living things, and they had gathered at a conclave on Qatar to mourn their fallen and to consider what remained of the Jedi Order in these darkening times. Nihilus came, and Qatar was stripped of life so utterly that it became a tomb, a world of dust and silence, and only one Meraluka remained. Visas Ma, a young woman whose connection to the Force was so profound that even that consumption had left her alive, though changed forever. She became bound to Nihilus not as an apprentice in any traditional sense, not someone learning from a master who could teach, but as something closer to a remora attached to a great shark, a small consciousness sustained by proximity to the hunger, fed by its scraps. And here is what haunts me about that arrangement. Visas was not unhappy, not entirely, because the alternative was to be unmade like everything else. And there is a strange mercy in belonging to something so absolute, even if that belonging costs you everything you were. Nihilus fed, and as he fed, he grew stronger and more hollow at once, his appetite more vast and less satisfiable, until the hunger became less like a purpose he served, and more like a natural law, less like a choice, and more like gravity. He commanded the Ravager, a warship that moved through space like a predator, and from its bridge he sent out his hunger, reaching across the void with hands that could not be seen, touching worlds that had done nothing to offend him, destroying them simply because they existed and therefore contained force, energy he could consume. The Jedi fled before him or died where they stood, because against Nihilus there was no strategy, no clever move, no philosophical counter. There was only the reality that he was consuming their existence itself, pulling the living force from their bodies and leaving behind empty shapes. But Nihilus had a peculiarity that his nature should not have allowed. He was not entirely hollow, because Mitra Surik existed, and Mitra Surik was herself a wound in the force. And when the two wounds came near each other, something unprecedented occurred. You see, Nihilus fed by pulling the force inward, drawing energy toward himself, and Surik pulled in a different direction entirely, drawing outward and away, and when their hungers met, neither could consume the other. There was something almost like relief in that meeting, I think, if a being of pure appetite could feel relief. The possibility that there might be something in the galaxy that did not resist, but simply was not there to be consumed, and therefore was not. The hunger that was Nihilus knew no satisfaction, because satisfaction requires an end, and an end requires a self capable of being satisfied, and none of that applied to what he had become. So he continued moving through the darkness, feeding on worlds he would never remember, consuming populations whose deaths meant nothing to him because meaning requires consciousness, and consciousness had been stripped away, leaving only the appetite and the white mask and the unintelligible screaming that was his only voice. I think about what happened at Malacha V often, and not just the explosion or the death count or the strategic failure, but the moment when something was unmade so thoroughly that it could only be remade as hunger, and I wonder whether that was something the Force allowed or something the Force itself became, a law written into being at the moment of that wound. What is certain is that Nihilus was the dark side made manifest in its purest form, not the passion of a Sith warrior, not the ambition of a lord seeking thrones, but the simple, eternal hunger that underlies all destruction, all entropy, the dissolution that awaits everything that exists. And when you understand him that way, not as a villain, but as a force, a law, a gravity pulling everything toward darkness, the triumvirate becomes clearer. Kreia offering betrayal and knowledge, Sion offering pain made into will, and Nihilus offering the silence that waits at the end of all hunger, when there is nothing left to consume, and so the consumer collapses into emptiness. The Ravager moved through the darkness, and the hunger fed, and the galaxy grew colder. There is a name whispered in the dark corners of the galaxy during these years, a presence that hunts with patience and a hunger of a different kind than Nihilus, not consumption, but obliteration. And what makes it worse is that Sion knows exactly what he is doing. He was not born this way, shattered and held together by nothing but refusal, though the exact origins of his fall are lost now, buried in the dust of archives that no one dares disturb anymore. What we know is that he was ancient, already old when the Republic thought itself eternal, already scarred by wars whose names have faded into the collective silence of history. He had fought in the Great Sith War, when Exar Kun and his followers tore at the fabric of the galaxy and lost, and Sion had been among those scattered, those who survived because they were too terrible to kill completely. And for 1,000 years, or perhaps longer, he was entombed, locked away in the sepulchre of Ludo Kresh, one of the ancient Sith Lords, his own body abandoned to decay in a place where the dark side pooled like standing water. I think about what that must have been like, conscious through all of it, feeling your own flesh turn to corruption around you, and asking yourself every day why you did not simply surrender to it. Then Kreia found him there, and she recognized something in that deliberate, defiant suffering that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten how to see. She called him forth, and he came, and in that moment, Sion understood that there was a philosophy being born that would use his pain not as weakness but as fuel. His body did not heal when she raised him. It was past healing, cracked and broken, and held together by nothing that any healer would recognize as legitimate medicine. But Kreia taught him something far darker, that if he refused to die, if he took every wound that the galaxy tried to inflict upon him and answered it with rage instead of surrender, then he could not be killed. That his hatred could become the binding agent that kept his shattered form together. That immortality was not a blessing granted by power, but a curse you inflicted upon yourself through the sheer refusal to accept death. And so Sion did not die. He was the Lord of Pain. They called him Darth Sion, and he wore that title like a second skin because his first skin was already wearing away. The thing that makes Sion different from Nihilus, from the blind hunger that moves without consciousness or mercy, is that Sion's suffering is deliberate, almost philosophical in its precision. Nihilus consumes because he is hunger made tangible, because the void in him demands to be filled and will never stop demanding. But Sion embraces his pain because he believes, truly believes, that suffering is a path to power, that a being who has been broken and has put himself back together 1,000 times is stronger than anyone who has never known fracture. There is a kind of logic to it, and a kind of terrible dignity, and I think that is what makes it so hard to look away from. He had come to believe, under Kreia's instruction, and through the proof of his own persistence, that weakness was the only true sin, and that pain was the forge in which strength was made. The Jedi, with their talk of peace and acceptance and moving beyond suffering, to Sion, they were the ultimate expression of weakness, of refusal to transform themselves through the very trials that were supposed to define them. And so when the hunt for the last Jedi began, when Kreia and Nihilus and Sion turned their attention to the Republic's shattered Jedi Order, Sion pursued with a focus that his partners did not share. Nihilus hunted because hunger drives hunger, without reasoning or strategy. But Sion hunted because he had declared war on weakness itself, and the Jedi were the last embodiment of that weakness in the galaxy that mattered. He moved across worlds looking for them, killing them when he found them, and there was something almost personal about it, as if each Jedi he destroyed was proof against some nagging doubt that lived in the broken places of his own mind. In the Peragus mining facility, aboard the Harbinger, in the temples and enclaves where the last remnants of the Order tried to shelter themselves, Sion was there, and when he appeared, death appeared with him. But what makes the story of Sion's obsession take on a different weight is what happened when he encountered the Jedi Exile, Mitra Surik. Here was a woman who had shattered herself, who had severed her connection to the Force after the catastrophe at Malacha V, who had walked away from everything the Jedi stood for and lived for 5 years in the cold dark of exile. She was broken in her own way, and when Sion found her, something shifted in his hunting. He was drawn to her, not with Nihilus's blind hunger, but with something that looked almost like recognition. Here was a Jedi who understood what it meant to be fractured, who had lived in pain and isolation without the comfort of the Order or the false peace of meditation. Here was someone whose very existence suggested that perhaps suffering could be borne not as weakness, but as a condition of survival. For a Sith Lord sustained entirely by his refusal to accept death, to meet someone who had accepted exile and emptiness, there was something in that which seemed to call to him. And yet, and I think this is important to understand, Sion's pursuit of the exile was not purely strategic. It was not just that she was the last Jedi he could find, or that destroying her would complete some plan of the Triumvirate. There was in Sion a hunger for vindication, a desperate need to prove that his philosophy of suffering as strength was the only truth worth believing, and the Exile, broken as she was, and yet still moving, still choosing, still refusing to surrender to her own fracture, represented a challenge to that belief. She had survived her pain, yes, but she had done so without his philosophy, without his dark side teachings, without his embrace of hatred as fuel. And that possibility, that there might be another way to endure, seemed to terrify him in a way that straightforward opposition never could. I find myself thinking about this a lot, about how much of the Sith's power comes not from the dark side itself, but from the terror of finding that it might not be necessary, that there might be other ways to become strong that do not require you to destroy yourself in the process. Sion was ancient and shattered and held together by nothing but will, and he was afraid, and that fear made him hunt with a precision that bordered on obsession. He would find her across the galaxy, pursue her through worlds and stations, and each time they met, some new fracture would open in his understanding of what he was. Because the Exile represented, in her own way, a question that Sion's entire existence was built on denying. What if you did not have to turn your suffering into hate to survive it? What if there was another choice, one he had never considered, because he had committed himself so entirely to the path of pain? Kreia is a name that means many things depending on who is speaking it, and I think that is by design. Once she was a Jedi Master, a historian, a keeper of knowledge, a woman who sat on the council and believed the Order stood for something worth preserving. She trained a student named Ravan, a brilliant, restless strategist who would one day reshape the galaxy. And when Ravan fell to the darkness in the unknown regions, the council blamed her. They said she had not seen it coming, or worse, that she had failed to prevent it, as though a teacher is responsible for the choices made by her student in the depths of space where no one can reach him. She was exiled for this, cast out by those she had served, and I think there is a particular bitterness in being expelled by an order that promised you unconditional purpose. When you believe you are part of something greater than yourself, and that belief is taken from you, what remains is not the peace of the Jedi. What remains is the question: if they were wrong about me, what else were they wrong about? Kreia traveled to Malachavi, that wounded place where the generator's shadow still lay across the landscape like a scar. And there in the ancient academy, she allowed herself to become something else. She took the name Treya, the betrayer, and embraced the dark side not as passion or hunger, but as something more precise, as a kind of knowledge. She understood the Force differently than the other Sith Lords we have met. For Nihilus, the Force was appetite, a void that demanded filling. For Sion, it was a weapon, malleable through will and suffering. But for Kreia, the Force itself was the problem. She came to believe that the Force was a kind of tyranny, that it bound all living things to predetermined paths, that it used people as instruments of balance, the way a musician uses strings. And she despised it for this. That is the particular darkness in Kreia's philosophy. It is not ambitious or passionate in the traditional sense. It is almost scholarly, almost reasonable, built on the premise that the Force itself is cruel, and that the only act of true freedom would be to sever it entirely, to cut the strings and let beings exist without that invisible hand. She taught this to Sion and to Nihilus, shaped them into weapons of her vision, and they, being Sith, betrayed her. They cast her out of the academy, stripped her of her power in the Triumvirate, and left her broken in the darkness, betrayed now by those she had taught, as she had been betrayed by the Jedi before. And here is where Kreia becomes truly dangerous. Because most broken people become smaller, but Kreia became more calculating. She had now been expelled from both the light and the dark, and this gave her a unique clarity. She could see both sides, could play both sides, could manipulate each against the other, because she had nothing to lose and everything to gain from chaos itself. She took on her old name again, Kreia, and walked the galaxy as something between mentor and ghost, seeking something she had lost in the Academy, a wound in the Force, a being who had severed herself from the current of power that bound everything else. That being was Mitra Surik, the Jedi Exel, the woman who had authorized the mass shadow generator at Malacha V and paid for it with her connection to the Force itself. Kreia found Surik aboard a mining station called Peragus, and she began to teach her, slowly, patiently, the way she had taught others. But the Exel was not like Revan or Sion or Nihilus. The Exel could not be corrupted by the dark side in the traditional sense because she had already cut herself off from the Force entirely. She was a wound, a void, a being through whom the Force flowed backward rather than forward, and this fascinated Kreia more than anything else in the galaxy. Kreia believed the Exel represented something she had theorized but never seen, a being capable of destroying the Force itself, of draining it the way Nihilus drained worlds, but consciously, with purpose, with the intention of liberation. And so she bound herself to the Exel through the Force, creating a connection that would grow stronger as the Exel grew stronger, teaching her to draw on bonds with her companions in ways the Jedi Council never had, showing her that strength did not come from the Force itself, but from the connections between beings. This was Kreia's true game. She was playing both sides not for power, but for apocalypse. She whispered prophecies to Jedi she encountered, telling them what they wanted to hear, steering them toward the Sith triumvirate and toward their own destruction. She guided the Exel toward confrontations with Sion and Nihilus, knowing that each encounter would make the Exel stronger, knowing that the Exel would eventually confront her, and believing that in that final confrontation, the Exel would become something capable of undoing the Force itself. She was, in every sense, a woman playing a 1,000-year chess game against the universe, and the Force was merely the board. I find myself thinking about Kreia more than perhaps I should. There is something in her logic that is not entirely wrong, and I think that is what makes her dangerous in a way that Malak or Sion or even Nihilus never quite managed to be. Malak hungered with the desperation of a child. Sion suffered like a martyr who had forgotten why. But Kreia thought, really thought, about what the Force was and whether it deserved to exist, and she arrived at conclusions that are, in their own terrible way, almost reasonable. She did not want to rule the galaxy or consume it or reshape it in her image. She wanted to destroy the mechanism by which anyone could ever be ruled or reshaped again. The irony, of course, is that in doing so she became more enslaved to her purpose than any Sith before her, that her quest for liberation became its own kind of chains. But perhaps that is always true of people who have been betrayed twice. They are so busy trying to ensure they can never be trapped again that they forge new traps of their own. And so as Kreia walked beside the Exel through the galaxy, teaching, guiding, manipulating, playing both Jedi and Sith against each other, she was essentially waiting for the moment when her greatest student would finally become powerful enough to do what she could not, to burn it all down. In the archive of this story, there are 19 Sith Lords, and the 17th is not Mitra Surik, the Jedi Exel, though the galaxy and the Force itself were shaped by the choice she refused to make. Let me tell you instead what actually happened, and why the premise you might have carried into this moment needs to be gently set aside, because the real story is stranger and more sorrowful than the one we thought we were about to hear. Darth Treya was Kreia, and she had been many things before that name found her. A Jedi Master who taught Revan when he was still called a brilliant strategist rather than a Dark Lord. She watched Revan fall to darkness in the unknown regions, watched the Sith Emperor work on him, watched her finest student choose the power of the dark side over the long, patient disciplines she had taught him. And when Revan returned, stripped of memory and fighting his way back toward the light, Kreia was cast out by the Jedi Council, exiled not for what she had done, but for the failure of what she had tried to prevent. The Jedi did not forgive the masters whose students fell, even if the master had nothing to do with the falling. even if the Master had opposed it. There is a particular bitterness in exile that comes not from punishment you deserved, but from punishment for a sin you did not commit. And I think that is where Krea's descent truly began. She found her way to Malacha V, where the wound in the galaxy still bled from the mass shadow generator. That terrible superweapon that Mitra Surik had authorized, that had killed hundreds of thousands in a single moment, and that had sundered the very fabric of the Force at that location. In that shattered place, Krea built the Traeus Academy and began to teach a philosophy that had taken root in her over decades, that the Force itself was not benevolent, not neutral, but tyranny. She believed that every being in the galaxy was enslaved by the Force, pulled by invisible strings toward destinies they did not choose, toward fates that were written before they were born. She found two apprentices there, Darth Nihilus, a hunger given shape, and Darth Sion, a being held together by hatred and refusal to die. And she taught them as she had taught Revan, but with a different intention now. Not to create a Sith Lord who would rule through strength, but to create instruments of destruction that might, in the end, damage the Force itself. And then they betrayed her. Nihilus and Sion, the very students she had gathered and trained, turned on her and cast her out of her own academy, stripping her power, leaving her diminished. And in that moment, her name became Darth Treya, the Lord of Betrayal, because she had been betrayed, yes, but also because betrayal was now the only truth she clung to. Everything was betrayal. The Jedi had betrayed her by exiling her for Revan's fall. Her students had betrayed her by turning the philosophy she taught them into something simple and hungry and destructive. The Force itself had betrayed every being in the galaxy by enslaving them to its will. And perhaps most importantly, she had begun to understand that she had betrayed herself by ever believing in the Jedi Order, by ever teaching with the hope that knowledge and discipline could steer a student away from darkness. Knowledge, she came to believe, did not protect against the dark side. It invited it. It was the same door. Into this broken moment of her own exile came Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile, the woman who had severed herself from the Force itself and walked through the galaxy as a wound, a void, a being who existed in the absence of Force connection. Mitra was hunted by the Sith Triumvirate, by Nihilus whose hunger recognized her as a void that might satisfy him, by Sion who saw in her a fellow sufferer and perhaps a path to something other than hatred. And Krea bound herself to Mitra as a mentor, as a guide, as a companion aboard the Ebon Hawk traveling the Outer Rim. But mentorship for Krea was a performance now. It was manipulation dressed in the language of teaching. She moved Mitra like a piece on a board, guiding her to temples where fallen Jedi had hidden their knowledge, to worlds where the dark side had carved deep scars into the fabric of reality, always with the intention of drawing Mitra deeper into her own wound, using her severed connection to the Force as a weapon. Here is the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about Krea. She was not lying when she taught Mitra. The philosophy was genuine. The belief that the Force was tyranny, that separation from it might be the only form of true freedom. Krea absolutely meant that. But the teaching was also a trap, a carefully laid net meant to draw Mitra toward the Sith, toward the dark side, toward a final confrontation at Malacha V where everything would be resolved. Mitra was meant to fall. Krea believed she had orchestrated it so precisely that falling was not even a choice anymore. It was simply momentum. It was fate. It was the inevitability that Krea had come to understand as the only truth. And yet, standing at the edge of it, Mitra refused. The Jedi exile, the woman who had severed herself from the Force, who walked as a wound through the galaxy, who had been abandoned by the Jedi Council and hunted by the Sith Triumvirate, who had every reason and every temptation to embrace the power that Krea offered, chose instead to return to the light. She chose compassion when the Force had taught her betrayal. She chose her companions when the dark side offered only isolation and hunger. She chose to see Kreia not as a mentor, but as a cautionary tale. What happens when pain is allowed to crystallize into philosophy, when exile is allowed to become identity, when betrayal is allowed to become the explanation for everything. And in that choice, Mitra did not become a Sith Lord at all. She became something more dangerous to the Sith than any apprentice could be. She became an answer to their question, and the answer was no. Kreia, facing defeat, prophesied the fates of those who had traveled with Mitra, a final act of connection, almost tender in its awareness, as if in the moment before her death she remembered what it meant to care for individual lives rather than abstract principles of power. And then she was gone, and the wound at Malacha V sealed itself, and the great game that Kreia had been playing, the manipulation of Sith and Jedi, the orchestration of apocalypse, the attempt to use the exile as a lever to destroy the Force itself, ended not with victory, but with the quiet refusal of a single person who had been betrayed so many times that she finally understood betrayal was a choice, and chose differently. On Malacha V, where once the mass shadow generator had torn the world apart and left a wound in both the planet and the Force itself, 3 Sith Lords were still alive, and they had begun, finally, to circle one another. Darth Nihilus had made the Ravager, a great broken Republic warship, half buried in the ash, into his throne, a floating sepulchre where he sat feeding on the pain and terror of those he kept imprisoned there, his hunger growing but never satisfied, his voice a sound like glass breaking underwater. Darth Sion walked the Traius Academy corridors, his ancient, shattered body held together by nothing but rage, nothing but his absolute refusal to acknowledge that he might ever be anything less than whole, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it seemed to fuel his very cells. Kreia, who had been betrayed by both of them, who had been cast out from the order she had built, had receded into shadow and patience, waiting for a wound in the Force to arrive, for Mitra Surik, the exile, the one being in the galaxy who had severed herself from the Force entirely and therefore might accomplish what the Sith could not. It is perhaps the cruelest irony in all of this story, and I find myself thinking about this a great deal, that the 3 who came together to hunt the Jedi never truly intended to coexist as equals. They were always, from the moment of their convergence, on the path to consumption. Nihilus was hunger without thought, a void that fed until it fed on itself, and Sion was suffering made eternal through will, and Kreia was the architect of betrayal, the woman who had taught them both, and therefore understood them too well to ever truly be safe from them. The exile arrived at Malacha V, having traveled across the galaxy, gathering the remnants of the Jedi, those few flickering lights that still persisted in the darkness, and with her came Visas Ma, a Muraluka born in darkness, bound once to Nihilus as surely as a puppet to strings, but who had come to understand, through the exile's presence and the strange grace of her wound, that hunger was not destiny. The Ravager hung in the ashen sky above Malacha V like a curse given shape, and when the exile and her companions came aboard, they descended into a ship that was not merely a vessel but a tomb, a creature of flesh and steel and the drained essence of the dead. Nihilus did not speak to them. His voice was only distortion and hunger, but they felt him, a presence so vast and so empty that standing near him was like standing at the edge of a chasm with nothing in the darkness below. When the confrontation came, it was strange and terrible. The exile stood against something that was barely a person anymore, that had worn away its own identity in the pursuit of feeding, and in defeating him, in understanding that hunger could not truly triumph because it consumed its own sustenance, she ended a kind of death that had been happening for years. After Nihilus fell, the exile descended into the Traius Academy, deeper and deeper into the stone and shadow, into the place where Sion had waited, sustained by nothing but his own refusal to die. Sion was waiting in a chamber deep within the academy, and when he saw the exile, his broken face twisted not only with hatred, but with something else, a kind of terrible recognition, a kinship of suffering that he could not name and therefore had to fight against with every fragment of his being. There is something in the encounter between the Exel and Sion that I keep returning to, because it is not, in its deepest moment, a battle about power or dominion, but about choice. The Exel had severed herself from the Force and survived it, had learned that disconnection did not mean weakness, that there were other ways to endure besides hatred. And Sion, who had spent centuries insisting that pain and refusal were the only truths, could not kill her because her very existence contradicted everything he believed. When she asked him to let go, to accept that his will to live, which had kept him animated for so long, could be released, Sion, in the end, did. It is a small thing, perhaps, but it is not. It is the moment when a being who had turned suffering into a philosophy was offered an alternative and chose it, and in that choice ended. Kreia waited in the Traeus core, in the heart of the academy she had built, and when the Exel came to her, the former Jedi Master who had fallen to darkness was finally, completely herself. They stood together, the teacher and the student, the betrayer and the betrayed, the one who sought to destroy the Force, and the one who had already severed herself from it, and they spoke before they fought of what the Force truly was. Kreia had come to believe that the Force was tyranny, that it used living beings as instruments, that to serve the Force was to be enslaved by it, and that the only true freedom lay in destroying it entirely. The Exel did not argue with her, and I think that is important, because in its way, Kreia was right. The Force does use its servants, does demand, does consume, but she had made a mistake that all the most intelligent tyrants make, which is to believe that because a thing is flawed, it must be destroyed entirely. The duel itself was extraordinary. Kreia wielded not one lightsaber, but four, moving between three blades she controlled through the Force while holding one in her hand, a display of mastery and will that was both beautiful and terrible. But the Exel, a wound in the Force, a being who had learned to survive by severing herself from the very thing Kreia was trying to kill, stood against her not as a rival for power, but as a mirror. When Kreia fell, and she did fall, she was not defeated by superior strength, but by her own misunderstanding of what the Exel represented. In her final moments, Kreia spoke prophecy, as the Sith often do when they feel the dark side carrying them toward dissolution. She spoke of the Exel's companions, of futures branching ahead, of Ravans still in the unknown regions, facing something far greater than any of the three, preparing against a true Sith Empire that had waited in shadow for 1,000 years. And then she was gone, and the triumvirate was ended, not conquered but concluded, the three Sith Lords scattered across death like pieces on a board swept away at the game's end. What strikes me most, looking back at the convergence on Malachavi, is that none of them truly wanted the same thing, though they pretended to. Nihilus wanted only to consume, Sion wanted only to endure in suffering, and Kreia wanted to unmake the Force itself, because she had come to believe that being a slave to it was worse than any physical death. The Exel, in contrast, wanted something far simpler. She wanted to live, and to help others live, not through some grand philosophy or restructuring of the Force, but through choice, through the small and radical act of choosing to continue. That was the difference, I think, between her and all three of them. She did not believe the Force needed to be killed, nor did she believe suffering was virtue, nor did she believe that hunger was inevitable. She believed simply that there was another way, and in that belief, she ended the age of the triumvirate, not with the explosion of a superweapon or the triumph of a conqueror, but with the quiet persistence of someone who had learned, against all odds, to hope. In the centuries after the triumvirate fell, the galaxy seemed to exhale. The immediate horror of Nihilus's hunger and Sion's rage finally released, and for a moment, the Jedi Order allowed itself to believe the Sith had truly been ended. But in the deepest, unknown regions, beyond the reaches of any Republic star map, something far older and far more patient was waiting. His name was Tenebrae, born on a world called Medriars roughly 5,000 years before the films, and from his earliest childhood, he understood something that most beings never fully grasp. That power is not something you are given, it is something you take. His father was a Sith Lord. a man of considerable strength, but Tenebrae came to understand, of limited vision. And the boy grew up watching this powerful man rule through fear and brutality, watching him believe that fear and brutality were themselves enough. Around the time he reached manhood, Tenebrae came to the conclusion that his father's power had become an obstacle rather than an inheritance, and so he killed him. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was simply inevitable, the way a son sometimes surpasses his father, the way a river overwhelms a stone. In those years, the great Sith Empire that had launched itself so confidently into the galaxy in the time of Naga Sadow had recently been shattered. The Jedi had proven more durable than anyone anticipated, and scattered Sith Lords were fleeing back toward Korriban, toward the hidden corners of space, desperate to preserve what knowledge and power they could salvage. Tenebrae recognized in this chaos not a defeat, but an opportunity. He gathered them to his world, Medriars, drawing together approximately 8,000 Sith Lords, a vast congregation of dark side adepts, all of them seeking to rebuild what had been lost. What he offered them was something he called a ritual. I think about this moment a great deal because it represents perhaps the most fundamental act of Sith philosophy ever conceived. The idea that power is not just taken from enemies, but that it can be extracted from your own people, your own allies, harvested wholesale like a crop. The ritual consumed all life on Medriars, 8,000 Sith Lords, all living things, the entire biosphere, drained into Tenebrae as though he were a conduit, and they were water pouring toward an infinite well. The planet itself became dead in the Force, a wound like Malacha V, but on a vastly greater scale, and Tenebrae emerged from the ritual transformed, no longer merely a powerful Sith, but something that might more accurately be called a god. He took the name Vitiate, the purifier, the one who cleanses, though there was no purification in what he had done, only a terrible consolidation. He had drunk the power of 8,000 beings and become something the Force itself had never before encountered, an individual so saturated with dark side energy that mortality became almost irrelevant to him. What remained of the Sith scattered Sith Lords fled with him into the deepest, unknown regions, beyond the maps the Republic had charted, beyond even the places where Revan and Malak had ventured. They rediscovered Korriban, the ancient homeworld, but they did not rebuild there. That would have been too obvious, too easy for the Jedi to sense. And instead they established their new capital on a world called Dromund Kars, hidden behind a perpetual storm that made it nearly impossible to locate through conventional means. There in the dark and the silence, they rebuilt. And here is where we must pause and understand something crucial about the Sith that distinguishes them from the Jedi in perhaps their most fundamental difference. The Jedi, when defeated, tend to believe they have failed and must change their philosophy. The Sith, by contrast, when defeated, tend to simply believe they have been temporarily inconvenienced. Vitiate had all the time in the world, literally, because his ritual had granted him something approaching immortality, and patience is a weapon that the Jedi have always underestimated. For over 1,000 years, while the Jedi Order rebuilt its temples and trained new Jedi, while the Republic consolidated its power and convinced itself the Sith threat had been permanently eliminated, the Sith Empire grew in silence. They did not wage open war. They rebuilt their fleets in hidden shipyards. They trained their warriors in secret academies. They developed new instruments of dark side mastery that would have terrified the Jedi had anyone known they existed. Vitiate, sustained by the ritual that had devoured an entire world, ruled from his throne on Dromund Kars, and he began to gather around him the most powerful Sith Lords of this new age, 12 of them, eventually forming what they called the Dark Council, each master of a different aspect of Sith power and influence. They did not regard each other as equals in the way Khan's Brotherhood had deluded itself into doing. They understood the hierarchy, and they understood that above all of them stood Vitiate, the Emperor, the one whose hunger had remade the galaxy's hidden history. There is something almost incomprehensible about ruling for 1,000 years, about maintaining power across such a vast span of time that empires rise and fall in the wider galaxy, while you remain unchanged, patient, certain. The Jedi experienced this time as relative peace, a period of rebuilding, of training the next generation, of studying ancient texts and refining their understanding of the Force. The Sith experienced it as the long darkness before the storm, the held breath before the strike. Vitiate was not content with immortality through the ritual. He had begun to conceive of something far greater. If 8,000 Sith could be consumed to sustain one, if an entire world could be drained to grant that one being quasi-divine power, then what might be achieved if the ritual were expanded? What if the entire galaxy were drained in the same way? All life, all Force sensitivity, all consciousness poured into a single vessel. The Sith Emperor began to dream of this, and as he dreamed, he planned, and his Sith Empire grew ready for war. When the attack came, more than 1,000 years after Vitiate had first begun his gathering, it would be total and devastating, a reminder that the Sith had never truly been defeated, only delayed. But that is a story for another chapter, when the wrath of the Empire finally emerges from the darkness and reminds the Republic of a truth the Jedi had almost forgotten. That patience, properly wielded, is the cruelest power of all. For 1,000 years after Darth Bane established the rule of two on Ruusan, the Sith Order disappeared from the known galaxy, not extinct, but patient, hidden, waiting with the methodical certainty of a hunter who knows its prey will eventually return to the same watering hole. In the depths of the unknown regions, beyond the borders of the Republic's star charts, something else was stirring. Not the thin, hungry lineage of Bane's two, but an empire, whole, vast, ancient, and never truly defeated. You have to understand what happened in the centuries after Revan vanished into that darkness, after Mitra Surik walked away from Malachi V and the Triumvirate fell to silence. The Republic celebrated the end of the Sith threat and believed itself safe, and the Jedi Order, weakened and scattered, prepared for an age of relative peace. But the Sith Emperor, Tenebrae, though few would know that name, was not in the Republic's territory at all. He dwelt on Dromund Kars, a world lost in perpetual storm in the deepest, unknown regions, a place so hidden that the Republic's greatest explorers had never come near it. There he had spent over 1,000 years consolidating the scattered remnants of the ancient Sith Empire, gathering what remained of its knowledge, its secrets, its hunger for power and domination. The Emperor was not young. He had walked among the Sith for eons, sustaining himself through rituals of dark alchemy so profound that he had transcended the ordinary boundaries of life and death. He had conducted a terrible ritual on a world called Nathema, a ritual so complete, so absolute, that it consumed all life there and granted him a kind of transcendence, a power that was no longer entirely bound to any single body or time. On Dromund Kars, he built a new dark temple, grander than anything Korriban had ever held. He established a dark council of 12 masters, each one powerful in their own right, each one a lord of the dark side, trained in the ancient ways. He gathered thousands of Sith, thousands, not two as Bane had decreed, but a whole civilization, a whole empire rebuilt from the ashes of what had fallen before. And while the rule of two plotted in silence and shadow across the known galaxy, preparing for a slow, patient rise that would take 1,000 years to culminate, the true Sith Empire in the unknown regions grew in isolation, relearning the knowledge that had been lost or scattered. They studied the holocrons brought from Korriban, the repositories of the ancient Sith Lords' wisdom, the teachings of Ajanta Paul, the sorceries of the first dark side masters, the alchemy that could reshape flesh and will and matter itself. They practiced rituals that predated the fall of Exar Kun, that predated even Naga Sado's invasion of known space. They built superweapons, not singular artifacts like the Star Forge, but entire fleets of them, hidden in the storms and shadow of worlds the Republic did not know existed. The knowledge preserved in those holocrons was not merely about power. though it was certainly that. It was about the philosophy of absolute rule, the truth encoded in the first Sith code. That strength alone deserved dominion, that weakness was a disease to be excised, that passion and hunger were virtues rather than flaws. Centuries passed this way, and the gap between the two Sith traditions widened into something almost unbridgeable. Bane's lineage, hidden in the Republic itself, worked through patience and subtlety. A whisper here, an assassination there, a senator corrupted, a general turned, a philosophy slowly poisoned from within. The true Sith Empire, by contrast, prepared for something far grander and more terrible. An open war, a conquest, a moment when the unknown regions would disgorge its darkness upon the galaxy, and the true Sith would reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. There's something worth sitting with here. The idea that there were two Sith traditions all along, running parallel through the same centuries, unaware of each other, each believing itself to be the true continuation of the old darkness. The rule of two, which would ultimately culminate in Darth Sidious, believed itself to be the culmination of Sith philosophy, the perfection of Bane's vision, the inevitable evolution of the dark side towards singular, supreme power. But the true Sith Empire believed the same thing about itself, that it was the true heir of Korriban, the preserver of the ancient teachings, the inevitable restoration of what should never have fallen. One of them was going to be very wrong about that. And in the 300 years before the rise of Anakin Skywalker, as the Republic moved deeper into its decline, and the political system that had held it together began to fracture, the ancient Sith knowledge slumbered in the unknown regions, accumulating power, accumulating will, waiting for the moment when the darkness would be ready to emerge. I think about that often, how the Sith had been fractured for so long into so many competing factions, all claiming legitimacy, all certain of their own rightness. Ajunta Paul's original empire had fallen to its own hunger. Exar Kun's reign had ended in exile and binding his spirit to stone. Naga Sado had retreated to Yavin 4, defeated and diminished. The Brotherhood of Darkness had been annihilated by the thought bomb at Ruusan. The Triumvirate had fallen at Malachavi, each member destroyed by a single Jedi woman who chose compassion over power. And yet the Sith endured. They endured because the teaching itself, that strength should dominate, that the weak should serve, that passion and hunger were virtues, was not contained in any single person or place. It was an idea, and ideas once released are almost impossible to kill. The true Sith Empire understood that. The Emperor understood that better than anyone. He had learned it across 1,000 years of solitude and study, and he had encoded it into everything he built on Dromund cars. Not a kingdom that would fall if one leader died, but a civilization that was made of the ideology itself, that would persist as long as even one person believed that strength was the only virtue that mattered. And so as the film's timeline approached, as the decades and centuries narrowed toward the moment when Anakin Skywalker would be born on a forgotten desert world, the darkness was consolidating itself in two places, along two paths, in two fundamentally different ways. Neither knew about the other yet, but both were drawing toward the same inevitable moment when the Sith would reveal themselves to the galaxy once more. And when they did, the Republic, weakened, divided, comfortable in the belief that the old darkness had been defeated, would discover too late that the nightmare had never truly ended at all. It had only been sleeping, gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to wake. 200 years before the films, in the deepest unknown regions where no starship from the Republic dares venture, the Sith Emperor sat alone in his throne room on Dromund cars, the black storm eternal outside the windows, and waited. He had been waiting for a very long time, centuries, in fact, and he had learned that patience was not a burden, but a form of power, perhaps the deepest form there was. His name had been Tenebrae once, in a life so distant it felt like someone else's memory, on a world called Medriars, where he had been born to a human mother, and a minor Sith Lord who taught him that strength meant the absolute annihilation of weakness. He had killed that Lord, his father, when he understood he could, and taken the name Vitiate, and from that moment forward he had understood something that very few beings ever grasped, that the Force itself could be reshaped by will, that reality itself was negotiable if you were patient enough and hungry enough to remake it. 5,000 years ago, in the chaos after Naga Sado's fleet had been shattered, and the Jedi Order began its patient hunt through the unknown regions, Vitiate had called together 8,000 Sith Lords to the world of Nathema under the guise of a great unifying ritual, a gathering that would make the Sith unbreakable. They came because they believed him, because he promised them power, because the Sith have always wanted to believe that this time, finally, they would not eat themselves alive. What happened instead was something that had never happened before and has never happened since. A ritual so vast, so perfectly orchestrated, that it consumed not merely the life of 8,000 Sith Lords, but the very presence of the Force itself from an entire planet. Nathema became empty in a way that goes beyond death, a world so void of the Force that even now, millennia later, sensitive beings who travel there report a feeling of profound wrongness, as though the universe itself has been hollowed out. And from that ritual, Vitiate emerged transformed, no longer quite mortal, sustained by something beyond life itself, rendered effectively immortal through a mastery of the dark side, so complete it had transcended the ordinary limits of even Sith power. He led the survivors away into the depths of space, away from the Jedi's reach, away from the Republic's borders, and on the storm-shrouded jungle world of Dromund Kars, he built something that had never been built before. A true Sith empire that would endure for over 1,000 years in absolute secrecy. Kars City rose from the jungle in layers of obsidian and red stone, a capital built not for conquest, but for consolidation, a seat of power where the Sith could finally stop tearing at one another and instead build something permanent. The Dark Council was his instrument, 12 Sith Lords of extraordinary power, each governing a different sphere of the Empire's vast machinery, overseeing military strength, intelligence, philosophy, ancient knowledge, the training of new apprentices, all of it arrayed in a hierarchy of ruthless clarity. And above them all, invisible and patient, was the Emperor himself, rarely seen even by the Council, ruling through decree and through agents scattered like seeds across the galaxy, bending even beings who served the Jedi Order toward his purposes without their knowledge. I find myself thinking often about what it must have felt like to him, those centuries of waiting, not as emptiness, but as accumulation. Each year that passed was another year the Jedi Order grew confident that the Sith were truly gone, truly ended, truly defeated at last. Each year was another ship completed in the hidden shipyards, another young Force-sensitive discovered and brought into the Empire's darkness, another scheme woven into the fabric of Republic politics, another piece of the long, patient revenge arranged. The Sith Emperor had learned from everything that came before him, from Ajahn Paul's belief that a single tyrant could rule forever, from Naga Sado's discovery that ambition and pride made you careless, from Exar Kun's binding of his spirit to a place rather than a people, from the Mandalorian Wars where Revan had waged such total war and still been betrayed, from Malak's hunger that had consumed him more surely than any enemy could. What Vitiate understood was that the Sith had always destroyed themselves because they wanted power in their own lifetime, wanted to see the fruits of their ambition, wanted to taste victory while they still lived to enjoy it. They had all, in their own way, been impatient. He would be different. He would wait until the moment of the strike was perfect, until every advantage had been accumulated, until the Jedi Order had grown comfortable in the belief that their enemy was only the slow corruption of individual hearts, the occasional fallen Jedi, the quiet spread of the rule of two through the ranks of the Republic itself. Then, when they were least prepared and most confident, the Sith Empire would return not as a distant rumor, but as an invasion force that would shake the entire galaxy to its foundations. There were agents everywhere by then, Assassins and spies, corrupted officials, dark side users hidden in plain sight among the Jedi themselves. Whisper campaigns that shaped what people believed was possible and what was not. There were the children of the Emperor, individuals whose minds he had seized and remade entirely, whose wills had been subsumed into his own, who served him without knowing they served him, whose very thoughts belonged to him. There was the one he called his wrath, an enforcer of such power and ferocity that even the most skilled Jedi warriors would hesitate to face him alone. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. And yet he waited still, because he understood something that I think very few beings truly grasp. That the waiting itself was part of the mastery, that the accumulation of power is different from its exercise, that a predator's greatest advantage is the prey's inability to believe the predator is really there. The storm outside the windows of his throne room on Drummond cars never ceased. Eternal, relentless, a kind of natural darkness that the planet itself seemed to breathe. And within that storm, the Sith Emperor sat in meditation, his consciousness extending across thousands of miles and through the bonds he shared with his agents and servants, and the fragments of his will that he had seeded throughout the Republic itself. He was, in a sense, everywhere and nowhere, fully present and completely hidden, a shadow that had learned to be patient enough to become permanent. The Jedi would see him coming, eventually, but by then it would be far too late. 200 years before the films, the final darkness was still gathering its strength, still organizing itself, still preparing the blow that would nearly destroy everything the Jedi Order had spent millennia building. And on a throne in a storm-shrouded city on a hidden world, the Sith Emperor smiled. If something so transformed by power and ritual and hunger could still be said to smile, and waited for the moment when patience would finally give way to conquest. Tonight, I want to take a step back from the great turning points and the individual Sith Lords and ask you to look at them together. All 19 of them, stretched across 10,000 years like links in a chain that neither the Jedi nor the Sith themselves fully understood until it was already too late. When you follow them in sequence, from Ajunta Paul standing at the threshold of Korriban to vitiate hidden on Drummond cars 5,000 years later, something becomes clear. This was never really about individuals seizing power. It was always about a philosophy trying to consume a galaxy. Let me explain what I mean by that. The Sith began as exiles, brilliant, powerful, proud Jedi who lost a war and refused to accept that loss meant the end of their vision. Rather than surrender or fade, they found a world of red stone and darker magic, a people already attuned to the dark side, and they built something that had never existed before, a civilization entirely devoted to the dark side's truth. Peace is a lie, there is only passion. That code became law, became culture, became the DNA of everyone born into the Sith Order from that first day forward. And here is what I keep coming back to. A philosophy that promises power through ambition, freedom through strength, and truth through passion. That philosophy does not die when its champions fall. It waits. It teaches itself to the next generation through tombs and holocrons, and the whispered knowledge passed master to apprentice. It survives its own destruction by being something deeper than any individual could be. Ajunta Paul built the first throne on Korriban, and the throne consumed him as it was meant to. Naga Sado and Ludo Kresh tore the Empire apart through rivalry, and the philosophy that created that rivalry lived on. Exar Kun bound his spirit to stone rather than accept death, and that refusal to surrender became a kind of immortality. You see the pattern yet? The Jedi believed that darkness would collapse under its own weight, that ambition and betrayal would grind the Sith into dust. And they were right. The Sith did grind themselves into dust over and over again. But dust can be reformed. Discel, the former miner who became Darth Bane, understood something the others did not. The problem was not the philosophy itself, but the way it was being lived. When everyone in the Order is a Dark Lord, when everyone is seeking to betray everyone else, The philosophy destroys itself not through the dark side's fault, but through its excess. So he changed the structure. The rule of two was Bane's gift to the darkness, not because it was kinder or more merciful, but because it was more efficient. Only a master and an apprentice means the apprentice lives every day knowing that one day they must be strong enough to kill their teacher. Only two means the knowledge cannot scatter, it must concentrate. Only two means the hunger cannot diffuse, it sharpens into a single point. The rule of two was patience itself given form. And it worked. For 1,000 years, through the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War, through the hunts of the Sith Triumvirate, through all the chaos and betrayal and suffering, the dark side endured not as an empire sprawling across the stars, but as a lineage waiting in shadow. You remember Revan, how he fell to darkness and then rose to the light, how he departed into the unknown regions seeking the Sith Emperor still waiting there. You remember Mitra Surik, how she survived by severing herself from the Force entirely, how she refused to embrace the hunger that defined Nihilus, the suffering that sustained Sion, the manipulation that bound Kreia. There is something in both of those moments, Revan choosing redemption, Mitra choosing compassion, that shows you what the Sith philosophy cannot quite digest. The dark side promises strength, and it delivers it. But strength bought through passion and ambition, and the willingness to betray and be betrayed leaves you hollow in a way the Sith have never fully acknowledged. Revan felt it at the Star Forge, standing in a machine designed to turn hunger into infinite power, and he chose to step away. Mitra felt it at Malacha, where Kreia tried to seduce her into becoming the instrument of the Force's own destruction, and she chose to remain whole. Neither of them defeated the Sith through superior power. They defeated them through choice, the ability to look at everything the dark side offers and say, no, not this way. And yet the Sith endured. Because there is a second thread running through all of this that we must not forget. While Bane's rule of two spread like a whisper through the Republic, building toward Palpatine and the rise of the Empire centuries hence, another Sith order was consolidating in secret. Vitiate, born Tenebrae, transformed by a ritual that consumed an entire world, hiding on Drummond cars behind a storm that seemed part of the planet itself. He was building something the Jedi Order did not even know existed. An empire of thousands, hidden, patient, waiting. The Sith did not put all their eggs in Bane's basket. There were two paths, two traditions, both moving toward the same emergence. And that is perhaps the deepest way to understand the legacy of darkness. The philosophy is harder to kill than any individual. The code echoes down through time, remaking itself in each generation. Strength is valorized, weakness despised, betrayal written into the very structure of succession. A person can choose to walk away. Revan did, Mitra did, but the Sith Order itself never chooses to walk away. It simply waits, transforms, reorganizes, and tries again. There is no end to ambition, no final victory that satiates the hunger for power. The Jedi understood this, which is why they called the Sith an eternal threat, a darkness that must be guarded against in every generation. What they perhaps did not fully understand is that the Sith philosophy was not a disease to be cured, but a fundamental law of nature. The law that says passion is real, that strength is desirable, that the weak cannot compete with the strong and should not expect to. To reject the Sith Order is not to disprove its premises. It is to choose a different answer to the same question: what does a being owe to power? And so 19 Sith Lords, stretching across millennia, are not really 19 separate stories. They are 19 chapters in a single, endless story about a philosophy seeking to remake the galaxy in its image. Some of them failed spectacularly. Malak's hunger consumed him before it could consume the galaxy. Exar Kun's temples were destroyed. The Sith Triumvirate fell on Malacha V. But failure, in the Sith tradition, is not an ending. It is preparation for the next attempt. Darth Bane took the rubble of the new Sith Wars and built something that would endure 1,000 years. Vitiate took the scattered remnants of the fallen Sith Empire and hid them so completely that the Jedi forgot they were ever a threat. And somewhere in the unknown regions, in the darkness between stars, Revan still moved in mystery, seeking something he could not name. This is the legacy of darkness, not that evil always triumphs, but that it never quite dies. It persists not because individuals are wicked, though some are, but because the philosophy itself makes sense to a certain kind of being, a being willing to climb on the backs of others to reach the sky. And as long as there are such beings in the galaxy, there will be Sith. There will always be Sith, whether they know to call themselves that or not.